Hey everyone, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy the audiobooks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a Patreon member. As a member, you'll gain the ability to request the next part of a novel audiobook I've uploaded, depending on your Patreon tier.
Percy figured he'd been in the vault for about a week, though keeping track of time was always difficult outside Remia. It had only taken him a few days to clear enough mana channels to fill up his host's second core. Piling onto the good news, the event had also gone down surprisingly smoothly. Sure, an elemental affinity wasn't the flashiest one to have, but it was definitely more useful than pure mana. Also, activating the core did strengthen Gabe's soul, causing the broken shards to swell, filling up more of their vessel. Sadly, the shift did cause their bond to loosen, forcing Percy to expend the last of his stashed mana to repair the connection. Though it wasn't that great a loss, since the golems were immune to his parting gift anyway. And today, Percy felt he'd cleared enough pathways to use the new core in a fight. Not that he was anywhere close to using it with finesse, but they should still be ready to tackle the fourth wave. As much as they'd love to prepare a little longer, their time was finite, and they needed to assess their situation. Asterisk. The white-hot axe slashed against the octagonal shield, the impact sending a shockwave reverberating through the room. However, the empowered flames barely carved an inch into the black metal before dimming, as the green inscriptions on its surface flashed brighter. Worse still, the construct easily brushed its left arm aside, tearing one of Gabe's wings to shreds, throwing him off balance in the process. And taking advantage of the opening, it lunged forward with its sword. Percy's host barely managed to leap to the side at the last second, escaping with a shallow cut on his upper arm. Not ideal, but definitely preferable to getting cleanly ran through by a blade wider than his thigh. Gabe clumsily walked backwards, putting some distance from the giant golem, each step awkwardly splashing through the viscous liquid covering the cube's floor all the way up to his knees. The construct simply stood in place, watching him disengage. It clearly wasn't in a rush to give chase. Some of the tar-like substance flowed to the golem, mending the small cut on its shield within mere seconds. "How the hell are we supposed to beat this thing?" Gabe asked. But Percy didn't have a good response either. Unlike the Swarm challenge, which involved lots of weaker enemies, the Gauntlet instead focused on singular, elite opponents. Their current foe was technically just another green golem, not unlike the four constructs they had defeated during Percy's first day in the vault. Still, its strength was nothing like those. It stood at twice Gabe's height, much like the previous golems, though this one was a fair amount leaner. Its shield was nigh impregnable, even harder than the bodies of the last ones, while its speed was nothing to scoff at either. Percy estimated it was faster than the starry soldiers back on Remia. Plus, this was still only the fourth wave. He wasn't looking forward to whatever monstrosity the challenge would throw at them during the sixth one. To make matters worse, Gabe's kit wasn't as well suited to this challenge. Sure, his bloodline and blessing did augment both his offense and defense to a degree, making him much stronger than the average green core. That said, these advantages couldn't compare with the boost to his endurance, which was what had ultimately carried him through the other one. And these challenges had clearly been designed taking into account that most of the Vault's surviving mortals were bred elites. I guess we expected as much. At least this one doesn't seem to have any ranged attacks. Percy said. Should we pull out our secret weapon? Gabe wrinkled his nose. Normally, I wouldn't be keen on letting somebody experiment with my body, playing around with new spells in the middle of a fight. Certainly not against such a monster. But I suppose I'm dead anyway, unless we can get this to work. Are you sure you won't make things worse, though? While Gabe would have to figure out how to use his second core by himself after his guest was gone, they had agreed to leave Percy in charge of the new affinity for now. Well, I'll do my best to not get in your way at least. I'll focus on supporting you, Percy said. Nodding, his host prepared the wings again, taking to the air. Reinforcing them with mana from his first core, he dove down towards their opponent. The golem raised its shield to block with practiced ease, though it was in for a small surprise this time. Right when they had covered about half the distance, Percy drew some mana from their second core, expelling it from their feet. The maneuver was a little rough around the edges, but it did work as intended. Picking up speed, they arrived a moment sooner than the construct was expecting as Gabe delivered another brutal blow. Like before, he failed to deal much damage, but he did land the attack at an angle, deflecting the shield to the side as he spun, opening the way for a second slash right at the golem's neck. Taken off guard, the construct still managed a last-second parry with its sword, though not before Gabe carved about an inch into its neck. The golem was even forced to take a step back. Sadly, the wound wasn't nearly deep enough to cause any lasting damage. The construct didn't miss a beat, slamming its shield right where they stood the very next second. It nearly crushed them into pace too, as Gabe still hadn't recovered his footing, having gone all out in that last exchange. It certainly didn't help they were essentially fighting in a swamp. Luckily, Percy intervened once more, pushing their body out of the impact zone with another burst of mana. The shield caused the tar to part for a moment, sending a tall wave of liquid metal slamming against the room's walls. It also pushed Gabe a few meters back, but that worked in their favor, helping them disengage sooner. Okay. Not a terrible first try, Percy said. Gabe hesitated briefly before nodding, reluctantly agreeing with that assessment. Try to weave the bursts of speed into all my moves, he suggested. All right. I'll let you know which way I'm pushing you a moment before I do it, Percy said. Repeating the same sequence, Gabe dove against the golem once more, with Percy accelerating his descent behind the scenes. Better prepared than before, the construct firmed its stance while waiting for the attack to arrive. But it never did. Right, Percy said, diverting their flight to the side at the last second. The unexpected turn allowed them to circle around the golem's massive shield as it awkwardly moved it, trying to trace their trajectory. Still, it was a little slower than them, allowing Gabe to roll in the air before landing a vertical slash on its scalp. Before he had the chance to split its head open, the shield was finally in the way to resist the attack, but Percy wasn't going to let their opponent have its way. Down, he said, adding momentum to his host's cleave. Swinging the shield up, the golem managed to throw them off by the time they'd cut about a third into its face, right around where the bridge of its nose would have begun if it had won. A wave of disappointment overcame the duo, though it faded once they noticed their opponent's inability to follow up with a counterattack. It was still on its feet, but the last blow had obviously done something. Not wasting the opportunity, Gabe tried to land another blow with his second wing. Forward. Percy released more mana from their back, clearly on the same page. The burst of wind was more modest than the ones before. Their second core's lower grade, coupled with Percy's inexperience with the air affinity, had already dried out their reserves. In fact, Gabe wasn't doing much better with his first core, having already exhausted most of his fire mana during the previous attack. That said, the golem wasn't in top shape either, its grip shaking after the desperate block and the nasty wound on its noggin. Expecting another attack to its neck, the construct tried to intercept with its sword, but Gabe had seen through its moves by now. Taking advantage of their shorter stature, he crouched below the swing, before cleaving at the golem's wrists. The hand holding the weapon was cleanly separated, though the wing fizzled out before it got through the other one too. As the heavy chunks of metal landed in the liquid, they sent a tall wave towards Gabe. A second one also rose when the construct lifted its foot to stomp them. Luckily, the viscous sludge impaired the golem's movements as much as it did Gabe's, if not even more so due to its increased bulk. Out of mana and wings both, the duo barely rolled out of the way. At least, the powerful current helped. However, the golem didn't stop after the first step. It stomped its way towards them, trying to pulverize them before they recovered, its previous nonchalance nowhere to be seen. The scene might have looked a little comical to an outsider, but neither Gabe nor Percy were in the mood to laugh, as they frantically dodged the golem's furious footfalls, trying to sneak in a few breaths in between. Some mana barely trickled into their cores, as a little more made its way to Gabe's back, reigniting the wings. Though they weren't the only ones recovering. The sludge kept flowing to repair the construct, the wound on its head already halfway mended. In fact, Percy didn't miss how the discarded sword had already melted down, as the severed hand and weapon were already reforming on the golem's arm. It was currently little more than a broken shard attached to a hilt, but it wouldn't be long before it was back to its former glory. Suffice to say, Gabe had no intention of letting his opponent complete its recovery. "It's all or nothing," he said, getting a mental nod back from Percy. Leaping back to avoid another stomp, Gabe tensed both calves, before springing forward like a coiled cobra, bolting through the space between the golem's knees. And, using whatever air mana he'd managed to recover, Percy added to his host's momentum, as the latter reinforced his wings once more. The duo knew they wouldn't get through their foe's defenses had they aimed for its torso or head, so they hadn't bothered trying. Their current goal was to sever another limb or two. The golem's shield was already on its way down, in a last-ditch effort to crush the pesky vermin by its feet before they completed their stunt. But it was too late. It wasn't just the shield, but the construct's entire upper body that landed in the black tar. It raised the tallest wave yet, submerging Gabe, who was still in the process of climbing back to his feet. The golem squirmed, trying and failing to right itself. The liquid rushed to repair it, dirtying its previously polished surface with sludge. Gabe and Percy were out of mana again, though time was on their side for once. They estimated they would recover long before the construct did. And sure enough, they were able to finish the golem a couple minutes later without any surprises. "And you said we need to beat 2 more of these things?" Percy asked grimly. Gabe grimaced too, before nodding. "2 stronger ones. Any progress with that book?" Percy asked. Another week had passed since their narrow victory against the 4th wave, though they had yet to challenge the 5th one. Acknowledging their inadequacy, they hadn't been in a hurry to move on, taking their time to get stronger, as they fought against the same opponent again and again. Challenging a previously beaten wave didn't reward any credits, but it was still good practice, letting them hone both their magic and their teamwork. Though Gabe was currently back in his room, as the 2 of them had plenty of work to do even during their downtime. "A little," he replied, before elaborating. "The gist is we can supposedly fuse the 2 elements, much like a composite affinity. In fact, since both of my cores have elemental mana, the result will be exactly like a composite affinity. However, there are a few complications." "Such as?" Percy asked. "Well, if you have a composite core, the 2 types of mana merge automatically inside it, without requiring any effort from its user. In my case, I'll have to expend a lot of willpower to replicate that feat," Gabe explained. "But there's 2 of us. Shouldn't that make it easier?" Percy asked. However, his host shook his head. "That's actually a bad thing. It makes it harder to blend the mana if there are 2 separate minds in charge. Also, the mismatch between my core's grades and the fact that only my fire mana is enhanced by a blessing will create an imbalance of power." Percy frowned. If this was true, they'd struggle to get the trick down in time. A possible solution was for Gabe to learn how to use his air magic by himself, but that would put too much pressure on him during the fight. Percy knew firsthand how difficult it was to keep track of 2 cores at once. It could easily take his host a couple months to get there. Especially since Gabe was in charge of the wings too. "The wings!" Percy exclaimed. "What about them?" Gabe raised an eyebrow. Percy grinned. "Perhaps we don't have enough time to master the moire art, but I have another idea to give us an edge in the 5th wave. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." The golem stood motionless at the other end of the room, its cold gaze locked on Gabe. It looked exactly like the previous one, though its shield had been replaced by a second sword. On paper, that should mean it had sacrificed some defense for the sake of offense, but Percy doubted that was the case. "I bet it's even better at parrying," he noted, getting a nod back from his host. That said, the 2 of them weren't the same as a week ago either. Percy had improved the most, having cleared plenty more channels and grown far more proficient with their mana. He'd even briefly considered working towards circulation, though he'd quickly shot the idea down. Meeting the requirements of the refined spell would take him way longer than they had. Oblivious to his guest's thoughts, Gabe summoned his wings, before readying his stance. Ironically, he was the one who'd improved the least, despite being the actual owner of the 2nd core. Still, he'd grown more accustomed to fighting alongside Percy against the elite golems. "Give it a try," he suggested. Percy acquiesced, focusing his senses on the flow of ambient mana. He'd already experienced Gabe's bloodline ability before, having briefly taken command of the wings back during his first day in the vault. However, his plan was to do something slightly different today. The idea was fairly simple. The only reason Gabe's wings manifested out of flames was because of his original affinity. Now that they possessed another core, there was no reason why they couldn't dig even more value out of the bloodline. Indeed, Percy identified a portion of the ambient mana being ignited at Gabe's back. He tugged at the flow to pry it from his host's control as the latter fought to remain in charge. One of them focused on the blazing heat burning in their sternum, as the other imagined the softer air mana dancing in their abdomen. Responding to their thoughts, the river of ambient mana split into two components, one continuing to fuel the wings right below Gabe's shoulder blades, as a smaller stream was pulled a few inches lower, forming a second pair below the first. Success! Percy was ecstatic, feeling the new ethereal limbs respond to his command. "Wow, I can't believe this actually worked," Gabe said. Percy sensed some mixed feelings from his host. The latter was happy he could use his bloodline with both cores at the same time, though he wasn't looking forward to juggling all these tasks by himself in the future. But this wasn't Percy's problem. Focusing back on the new wings, he quickly noticed they were both smaller and weaker than the other pair. It made sense. While the ability was fueled by ambient mana, its strength was correlated with the corresponding core's grades. Percy's control was a little clumsy too, but it would have to do for now. After spending a few minutes to adjust to the new appendages, the two looked back at the construct. It was still patiently waiting for them to make the first move. "I'm going in," Gabe said, flapping his wings once, soaring halfway to the ceiling. Meanwhile, the second set remained folded behind their waist. Percy didn't want to interfere with his host's movements, so he'd reserve the new limbs for a time when they actually needed them. For now, he simply augmented Gabe's speed the good old way. That said, their cooperation had grown a lot more refined over the past week. The air mana flowed underneath Gabe's wings, giving him an even greater boost than if Percy had tried to propel their body directly like before. And just like that, they dove upon the golem, finally beginning the battle. Surprising no one, the construct raised its swords to parry the white-hot axes, before trying to land a blow of its own. Gabe ducked and weaved to dodge the colossal blade by a hair's breadth as he tiptoed around the golem, looking for an opening. The construct was even faster than the previous one, but Percy expertly unleashed small bursts of air around their body, elegantly augmenting his host's every move, using the minimum amount of mana each time. Two figures, one man-sized, the other colossal, danced amidst the flurry of slashes, the black ones parting the viscous tar in their passing, as the white-hot ones raised the temperature to a dangerous level. The axes were even hotter than before, with Percy's air mana adding more fuel to the flames, while sharpening them and accelerating them further than Gabe could manage on his own. By now, their skin was blistering and peeling, as a red sheen coated the obsidian golem. Every now and then, the weapons collided, sending loud shockwaves bouncing around the walls of the cube, throwing the previously calm surface of the swamp into turmoil. No side seemed to gain an advantage, as neither combatant managed to land a single blow. At least, that was the case until Gabe and Percy's mana was exhausted a minute later, leaving them at the golem's mercy. A massive sword descended, its edge sinking halfway through the floor, though Gabe was already a few meters back, Percy having saved their asses with the first flap of their new wings. The golem returned to its default state, giving them a chance to recover. Percy had yet to fully understand what the condition was for the constructs to bother chasing. His best guess was that disarming it would do the trick. "Do you want to keep going like this?" he asked his host. While they seemed equally matched with the golem at the moment, they possessed an advantage their opponent sorely lacked: the ability to grow. Right now, they could only use their newer limbs as a way to disengage, but it wouldn't be long until they weaved them into their fighting style. Plus, it would only be a matter of time until they grew accustomed to the golem's movements too. "Sure." Gabe shrugged. "Let's take it nice and easy with this one. Cube. Start the gauntlet challenge." Green level. User ID 00 for 5512. Authorization granted. Starting Gauntlet Challenge, Green level. The user has already cleared Wave 5. Do you wish to resume at Wave 6? Warning, Wave 6 contains a far more powerful opponent. Are you ready for this? Gabe asked his guest. Another month had passed since they first cleared the last wave, breaking Percy's record for the longest-lived clone, and by a huge margin at that. By now, they'd already grown rather skilled at seamlessly weaving their two types of mana and both sets of wings into their fighting style. Though their strength was beginning to plateau. The only avenue that still left them a lot of room for improvement was mastering the moire trick, fusing their affinities into one. Gabe and Percy had actually made some progress in that department, but the result wasn't quite ready to be relied upon during the fight. Go for it. Percy replied. Yes. Gabe spoke out loud. Choice confirmed. Wave begins in 18 writs. While it would have certainly been more prudent to wait longer, the two were already running out of time. Despite their relatively healthy body, Gabe's recent promotion, and the crazy amount of soul mana Percy had invested, the patches holding their souls together were finally beginning to come undone. Their most optimistic estimates gave them a few more days together, though they figured it was best not to cut it too close. Wave begins in 12 writs. All in all, they weren't particularly happy with their odds, but it wasn't like they'd miraculously get stronger if they held on for another day or two. Naturally, the thought of turning Gabe into a familiar had crossed Percy's mind. While his stingy host wasn't always the most pleasant to be around, Percy had still grown fond of the jellyfish person after spending so much time fighting alongside him. That said, he'd rather not resort to that before exhausting all the alternatives. While Percy had never regretted creating his crow familiar, the jury was still out on whether he'd done right by the original Mickey, as his pal had yet to recover any of his old memories. Wave begins in 6 writs. Not to mention the personal cost involved with his secret art. Perhaps, he could get Oren to take care of him for a few weeks if he ended up in a coma again, though he wasn't looking forward to explaining everything to the alchemist afterwards. Then there was the question of whether he'd even find a suitable body for Gabe in the middle of the guild. I'll only do it if we're out of options. Wave begins. May your challenge be successful. Black metal poured down the cube's walls once more, the level of the liquid rising to Gabe's knees soon enough. Only then did a blob of sludge swell on the floor about a dozen meters in front of them, as their latest opponent started forming. Of course, Gabe and Percy had tried attacking the golems in this vulnerable state in the past, but they'd only wasted their time. Despite the cube's words, the challenge wouldn't officially begin until the construct was done taking shape. Not that it took very long, as the new golem stood tall before them mere moments later. This one had 2 pairs of arms, reminding Percy of the natives on Hugh. Each of its 4 hands held a curved saber, their edges fanning out in a ferocious stance, tilted slightly towards Gabe. Even more unsettling was the construct's gaze, which seemed no less piercing than its weapon's tips, flooding the room with a palpable sense of oppression. I have a bad feeling about this. Percy didn't wait for the golem's inscriptions to finish lighting up, hurriedly pulling the ambient mana towards their back. Following his lead, Gabe did the same, as the stream split off, coalescing into 2 pairs of nascent wings. The upper ones were the widest and most majestic, made of scorching blue flames. The others were more modest, elegantly crafted out of swirling gusts of wind, carrying a faint green tint. In any case, it was a good thing they hadn't waited. This time, the golem didn't give them the chance to attack first, seizing the initiative instead. It pounced towards them like a tiger, a short-lived crater forming in the swamp where it had stood just a moment ago. Its visage rapidly enlarged in their vision as it flew mere inches above the black substance, 2 of the saber's carving waved into the formulacerine surface of the liquid metal. As for the remaining pair, they were crossed in front of the golem's face, clearly impatient to taste Gabe's blood. Flapping all 4 of the half-formed wings, they barely managed to escape diagonally to their right, though not before losing both left wings and getting a nasty cut below their ribs. What the hell? Percy moved their bottom right wing opposite the upper right one to balance it out. It was a nifty trick they'd come up with in the past few weeks, taking advantage of the fact their wings weren't actual body parts, allowing them to be shifted around somewhat freely. Their flight was a little lopsided, but hovering for a while longer wouldn't be an issue. I suppose this one won't let us recover between rounds, Percy said as they rose higher, putting more distance from the ground. Geez? Real dick move to change up the golem's tactics with no warning. Gabe groaned. Had the gods in charge made the previous constructs passive out of kindness? Or had it all been a ruse to lure challengers into a false sense of security? Either way, their trouble had only just begun. Before the severed wings were done recovering, the golem tilted its head up, its eyes flashing a shade brighter, sending a chill down their spine. Then, it moved again. It tossed its sabers in well-spaced intervals, the colossal blade spinning as they sliced through the air towards them. Even in his current state, Gabe didn't have much difficulty maneuvering around the projectiles, but that was beside the point. The shockwaves Percy had expected to hear never came, the weapon spluttering into blobs of liquid the moment they made contact with the cube's sides, rolling down the smooth walls. And the sludge constantly flowed to the golem's feet, its sabers reforming one after another, ensuring the construct would never run out of blades to throw. Shit! It's going to tire us out eventually, Percy noted. The barrage was a lot more forgiving than the rain of needles in the swarm challenge, but it seemed like it could go on forever. While the wings didn't use up any of Gabe's mana, keeping them active and flying around was still mentally taxing. I guess we have to go on the offense. Gabe shrugged. Yeah. I suppose that was the plan all along. Percy nodded. It's not like we can get the reward you need by dodging. Their wings had recovered by now. They took a moment to rearrange them into their original configuration, before circling the golem cautiously. The good news was that the moment it threw each of its weapons, it was left with just 2.5 sabers, giving them a slight opening to attack. Though it wouldn't be long before the construct was back to its top shape. Let's use all our mana at once, Percy suddenly suggested. There's no sense in rationing it, as it won't give us a chance to disengage anyway. Gabe raised an eyebrow. But what if we fail? We'll be completely defenseless, he protested. You can still verbally terminate the challenge, can't you? Percy reminded him. That was how Gabe had tried to escape from the swarm challenge when things had gone downhill, though he'd been a moment too late, leaving him riddled with fatal wounds by the time Percy found him. Right, okay. I'm going in, the former replied. As soon as they dodged the next incoming saber, Gabe reinforced the upper pair of wings with fire mana, turning them white before flapping them. Percy mirrored the motion with the lower pair, while also skillfully distributing the air mana throughout their body. Their vision blurred for a moment, but they'd done this so many times in the past month they didn't need to see where they were going. Reaching the golem, the first of their blazing axes cleaved at its neck, leaving a distorted afterglow in its wake. The concentrated mana burst into a wave of force and heat upon impact, spreading outwards from the point of collision. Gabe had to actually close his eyes to shield them from the flash, rendering the duo unable to gauge the extent of the damage they dealt. Still, they felt their opponent's sabers bend and crack, though the attack ultimately failed to pierce through. But that was okay, the second wing was just behind the first. This one finished the job, as shards of metal flew in all directions, the white blade slicing through the damaged weapons before delivering a diagonal slash on the golem's torso. The construct staggered, its inscriptions even dimming for a moment. But it didn't collapse. Soon, the runes on its polished surface shone brightly again, as it swung the broken sabers towards Gabe. Percy slammed the second pair of wings against one another, right in front of their chest. The burst of wind pushed them backwards, letting them narrowly dodge the fragmented edges of metal thirsting for their flesh. C-Cube. Abort wave. End challenge. Gabe barely got the words out as the golem was already airborne, falling rapidly towards them. The two stumbled backwards in their desperate attempt to buy an extra fraction of a second, the shadow of the golem's visage shrouding their vision, as the viscous sludge enveloped their back, hugging their sinking body. Their pupils widened as they stared in horror at the colossal fist just inches from their face, about to smash their head open like a watermelon. The sickening sound of their skull cracking never came. Gabe thought it might have already happened, too fast for them to register, but Percy had experienced enough deaths to be confident this wasn't it. Still, they held their breath, remaining motionless under the surface of the dark swamp, unsure whether the challenge had stopped in time, or whether the golem had simply lost track of them. It was most likely the former, but neither of the two was feeling brave enough to check. Sure enough, the liquid's level dropped soon, draining into the floor, exposing their body once more. Only then did they reluctantly open their eyes, before bursting into labored breaths a moment later, their chest heaving up and down. "Well, that sure sucked," Gabe said. "Next time we fail, and there will definitely be a next time, please say the words faster." Percy berated him. Gabe didn't respond, focusing on refilling his cause for a while. Only after they'd fully recovered did he speak again. "How are we going to get through this?" Sadly, Percy had no good answer for his host, feeling just as lost. Of course, they'd encountered many difficulties during the previous waves too, but they'd had plenty of options at the time. They'd adjusted their tactics, honed their cooperation and magic, or grown more used to their opponent's moves. This time, things weren't as simple. They had no idea how to improve enough in the next couple of days, plus the golem's response had been too fast to read. They'd basically attacked it blindly, at a speed they could hardly even grasp, yet that hadn't been enough. It had parried their offense rather easily. Despite going all out, they'd barely broken through its defenses, and even then, it had deflected the trajectory of their slashes enough that they'd no longer posed a threat to its integrity. "You're not going to like this, but I suggest we keep doing the exact same thing and hope we get lucky," Percy said. Gabe's jaw slackened. "That's the shittiest plan ever," he complained. But Percy shook his head. "It's all I've got. Feel free to suggest something better." Gabe groaned as he pushed himself up, his body hurting all over. While they'd healed perfectly after the swarm challenge, they'd accumulated a lot of new injuries over the past few weeks. The peculiar thing was most of them had been self-inflicted. While he and Percy had done a commendable job dodging most of the golem's attacks, the intense heat of their own spells had caused plenty of nasty burns all over their skin. Naturally, mags possessed high innate resistance to their own magic. That said, Gabe's blessing and bloodline already pushed his spells close to his limits. Adding the extra air mana into the mix, and the flames had grown a little too hot for comfort. Unfortunately, beggars couldn't be choosers. They'd needed every bit of firepower to even get this far. Plus, although Gabe had been forced to splurge a few credits on ointments and other remedies, to his great dismay, none of these injuries were life-threatening, so they'd chosen to endure them. "Let's do it then. I haven't gone through all this crap just to fail at the last juncture," he said resolutely. Soon, they began the challenge anew. Knowing what to expect, they'd already prepared beforehand, waiting for the golem to toss a couple of sabers their way, before diving in for an attack. Again, the clash had been too quick and far too hectic to fathom, though it had gone slightly better than the previous one. While the construct was still alive, this time it had lost 2 of its arms. Perhaps, this would have been the perfect opportunity for Gabe and Percy to finish it if they had any mana left, which they didn't. "Cube." Abort challenge, the former spoke with a heavy heart once more, not giving their opponent the chance to retaliate. And about half an hour later, they went for their third attempt, managing to land a good blow on the golem's head, slicing a corner off. In fact, the injury had even left it disoriented for nearly half a minute, making them think this was their lucky break. Unfortunately, just when they repaired their wings enough to go for the finisher, the golem attacked, nearly beheading them before they hurriedly ended the challenge. "Again," Percy said. This time, they tried to sneak up on the golem from behind. To their great horror, they discovered it possessed eyes at the back of its head too. Not only that, but it could easily spin its arms around, causing the clash to go no better than the previous ones. 5th attempt. Abort. 6th. 7th. 10th. Abort. 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 Gabe was sitting by the side of the cube, resting against the wall. They'd recovered a few minutes ago, but they weren't in a rush to try again. Verbally terminating the challenge and restarting whenever it suited them might seem like a great loophole, and it was, to an extent, yet it wasn't without cost. Recovering their mana between rounds wasn't difficult, but they had no way to heal their wounds. By now, Gabe was a complete mess, his skin peeling and bleeding, his flesh battered and sore. Not to mention the risk of incurring much more serious injuries with each attempt. 2 tries ago, they came this close to losing an arm, narrowly getting away with a nasty gouge on their shoulder. And Gabe couldn't just ask for more life mana if they succeeded. He needed the soul mana, and he seriously doubted the cube would be generous enough to give him both. Also, they were running out of time. Fast. Percy could feel the patches falling apart one after the other. By now, he had to get creative, shifting around the mana, trying to keep their soul from crumbling before its time. Let's try fusing the affinities again, Gabe suggested. I know it's a long shot, but it's the only thing we haven't tried. Percy considered it for a few seconds. It's more than a long shot. The best we've managed was weaker than your air mana alone. And we need something more destructive than your all-out attack. Gabe grinned. As a wise man once said, feel free to suggest something better. Fine, but let's practice for a couple hours without starting the challenge. No sense in testing a new spell while having an angry golem trying to slice us into strips. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Whether it was Remia or the Vault of Magic, less than 1% of the population was born with a composite core. That said, these affinities were well understood, as they represented elements abundant in nature, such as mud, steam, or magma. So, while neither Gabe nor Percy had personally seen someone use the light affinity before, they had a pretty good idea what to expect. Sadly, that didn't seem to help them much in mastering it. Steady, keep going, Percy said, focused on the rotation and integrity of the small tornado between their palms. Gabe, on the other hand, was doing his best to lower the intensity and temperature of his own fire mana, trying to match his guest's output. I think we're nearly there, he said, watching the flames spin. The air mana provided fuel for the fire, turning it hotter, while the heat allowed the air to move even faster. The two components were rapidly consumed, generating an effect more potent than the sum of its parts. The blue vortex grew brighter, though this wasn't due to Gabe's blessing. He was still doing his best to hold it back for now. Perhaps they'd need to add it to the finished product later, but for now their focus was on blending the affinities together. And as the scorching wind shrunk into a ball, their shape and color shifted, turning the tornado into something different. A white sphere. It was so bright, it caused Gabe to look away. In fact, it seemed even hotter than his strongest flames, though it had lost much of its substance, turning matter into pure energy. So far so good. Percy nodded. He couldn't help but salivate over the prospect of fusing his own mana back home. He knew it would be harder as neither of his affinities was elemental, which meant their fusion was inherently unstable. Still, the Moire book suggested it was possible. Stop daydreaming and focus on the sphere. Gabe snapped him out of his thoughts. Right. Percy replied as his attention returned to their project. This wasn't their first time getting to this point, but they needed to pour a lot more mana into the spell, and to control it much better before it could be used against the golem. The two coordinated to increase their input at the same rate, slowly expanding the radius of the sphere, as its blinding rays grew more intense. Gabe's eyes watered even through his closed eyelids, though they didn't stop. They needed this to work. Running out of ideas, they tried to divert the beam away from their body. Partial success. About 70% of the light was directed to the front, though the remainder still hurt them. Even worse, the higher output combined with their rough attempts at manipulating the spell affected its stability, causing it to blink rapidly, putting it on the verge of fizzling out. I can't keep this up. Gabe winced, before allowing it to come apart. Smoke was coming out of their palms, which had received the full brunt of the fused mana. Man, I don't think we've improved in the last few hours at all, Percy noted. Me neither. How are our souls doing? Gabe asked. Not great. I've had to actively expend my willpower to keep the patches stable for a while now. If we start fighting the golem again, we'll only last a few more tries. Gabe plopped on the ground weakly as Percy felt despair seeping through their connection. It's over. It was all for nothing, the former said. It wasn't. There's still one more thing I can try doing for you if we fail to beat the golem. Though you won't like it. Gabe raised an eyebrow, prompting Percy to explain how his familiars worked. So, you're telling me I'll lose all my memories and potentially end up reincarnated as some vermin, small enough to fit in my palm? And that's the best-case scenario, assuming all the stars align? What's even the point? He asked. I know it sucks. It's why I didn't mention it earlier. Still, it's on the table if you want to try it. Percy said. His host didn't respond immediately, taking some time to consider his options. Eventually, he spoke. All right. If all else fails, I'm willing to give it a shot. However, I'd like to test one last thing before we resort to that, he said. I'm listening. Percy replied. Well, it's nothing too revolutionary. Just a final gamble. So far, we've split our efforts between making the spell powerful enough to damage the golem while also controlling it to keep ourselves safe. Percy understood what his host was getting at. You want to ditch the second part? Gabe nodded. I don't know if we'll succeed, or what state my body will end up in, but it might be better than becoming an amnesiac critter. All right. Start the challenge then. Naturally, they'd only get one chance, as they didn't have the luxury of injuring themselves repeatedly to hone their suicidal attack to perfection. Gabe went through the motions, restarting the wave, as the two summoned their wings and took to the air. The duo looked ahead as the black metal began pouring down the walls of the cube, watching their opponent form once more. And this time, there would be no giving up. In a few short minutes, Percy would finally return to Remia. The only question was whether he'd do so alone or with company. Gabe's palms burned as the white sphere expanded between them. The dark blob rapidly took shape right below the duo, putting pressure on them to fuse their mana faster. Naturally, they'd already abandoned all caution, willingly accepting the painful cost of the technique. Their eyeballs felt like they were melting in their sockets, the entire front side of their body peeling. We need to time this right. Gabe said. We'll only get one shot. Percy nodded. Yes. There are 3 things we need to do at once. We have to push the rest of our mana into the sphere, while at the same time unleashing your blessing to raise the temperature even further. Meanwhile, I'll try to direct as much of the explosion towards the golem and away from our face. Make those for things then. Let's also try tossing our wings into the mix. Even if the ambient mana fails to add to its strength, it might shield our body from some of the damage. With the plan set in stone, the duo held their breath, focused on their opponent's form. Of course, they couldn't gaze at it directly, as their head was tilted away from the radiant star thrumming between their hands, but they could still observe it through mana sense. The vague outline of green finally finished taking the shape of the golem, complete with four sabers tightly grasped in its fists. Not wasting a moment, the two rushed to their tasks before their enemy started hurling weapons at them. First, they stopped flapping the wings, only slightly adjusting them to maintain their orientation, allowing themselves to fall closer to the construct. Pushing all the mana out of their 2 cores, they let it gush through their channels, soon flooding the spell with an influx of fuel, causing it to burn brighter than ever before. The golem finally reacted, tossing the first saber towards them. But they were ready for that. They dodged with a quick flap of their upper wings, before returning to their previous position using the second pair. Next, estimating they were already close enough to the golem, hardly 3 meters away, they finally folded all 4 wings to their chest, dipping the tips into the sphere. To nobody's surprise, the mana from their sternum had already dominated its counterpart, technically making the attack more of a fire affinity spell laced with hints of something else. Its temperature had already surpassed anything they'd tried before, as it happily devoured part of the wings too. They heard the golem throw another blade, but they didn't care. This one never reached their body, melting mid-flight, unable to withstand the intense heat of the sphere. SSS. A few scorching droplets landed on Gabe's skin, causing him to wince as his flesh sizzled even faster in those spots. If it hadn't been for his passive resistance to heat, he would have long turned to ashes by now. But the two were already far too deep to back down. When they were mere inches above the golem's head, they finally let go of the mana, doing their best to divert it away from their body. Making a shrill, high-pitched sound, the sphere burst out in every direction. The shockwave itself wasn't that powerful, as the spell's focus was its luminosity and heat. The last thing Gabe and Percy saw through their closed eyelids was a flash of white, as a warm trickle rolled halfway down their cheeks, before evaporating. They could also tell when their left hand literally crumbled into dust. The entire front side of their body felt like it was dropped on a frying pan. Yet, despite all the pain and worry, Percy couldn't help but feel some fleeting pride over the sheer power of the spell he'd just helped cast. It had truly pushed the upper limit of what a green core should be capable of. That said, his status remained silent, as this wasn't something he could reproduce on his own. Though, had he been the one responsible for naming it, he did have an idea what to call it. The light affinity spell, Collapsing Star. Luckily for them, the viscous tar coating the room's floor cushioned their landing, sparing them from further injuries. Of course, the bubbling liquid was rather hot to the touch, but it couldn't compare to the attack they'd just eaten to their face. Though it did aggravate their burn some more. Sinking to the bottom, they remained motionless on the floor, waiting with hope for their victory to be announced. And soon enough, the viscous metal was drained out of the room, as the soulless voice spoke again. Congratu, cleared, rewards. The two had some trouble making the words out through the ringing in their ears, but there wasn't any question as to their contents. Oblivious to Percy's thoughts, the system kept speaking. Awarded. Current. Wave. Bonus reward, request, limited. Gabe. You're up. Percy prodded his host after realizing he'd remained silent for a few seconds too long. What happened? The latter asked, apparently only now regaining consciousness. We've done it. Get it to heal you. Remember to ask for the soul mana first. Percy advised. Gabe tried nodding, but even this slight motion hurt. Heal, my soul, and my body, he spoke in a hoarse voice. Evaluating request. Percy sure hoped the cube had heard the message clearly. It would be so stupid to fail at the last stretch because of a simple miscommunication. Luckily his worries had been misplaced, though the response wasn't the ideal one. Not that they heard it in its entirety, but they still made out the gist of it. Evaluation complete, outside parameters, only eligible, one type of mana, prioritize soul. It's your call, Gabe. My offer is still up. What do you want to do? Before coming to the vault, Percy had no intention of creating a second familiar anytime soon. While he'd grown somewhat used to having two connections at the same time, it would inhibit his ability to send out more clones for the foreseeable future. Of course, it would be worth it if it was part of his project to get a starry wasp familiar, but that wasn't on the table right now. Sadly, he had no idea how to get his hands on a suitable egg. Still, he wouldn't abandon his new friend for his own convenience. What do you think about the state of my body? The latter asked. Naturally, Gabe understood his own physiology better, but he knew Percy had possessed dozens of dying bodies in the past. Evidently, he could use a second opinion. Percy remained silent for a few moments, considering it. Every now and then, he tried moving a muscle, gauging the condition of his host's various body parts. I don't think your wounds are quite lethal, but they aren't exactly minor either. I'm sure you've noticed some of the most egregious injuries already. Gabe sent a mental nod back. He'd lost both eyes and one hand. What wasn't as clear was whether the remaining limbs could be salvaged. Even if they could, the numerous burns on his body would easily take several months to heal. At first, Percy had thought his friend could just look for a mortal with the life affinity to heal him, but Gabe had already explained that was unlikely to work. Mortals in the vault were highly competitive, as the available resources were limited. There was no sense of camaraderie between them, plus the gods liked things this way, as it helped them cultivate the strongest ones. Sadly, Gabe would only have himself to rely on. Worse still, his next opportunity to fix his body was decades away, at best. Even if he mastered the rest of his arsenal after Percy left, he couldn't reach the 12th wave in either the Swarm or Gauntlet challenge. Probably not even if he'd been healthy. Certainly not in his current state. Plus, getting into Manuscript would be much harder now that he was both blind and crippled. In fact, advancing to Blue didn't exactly guarantee he'd clear the 6th wave either. It was entirely possible he was stuck like this forever. I'd still rather give this a shot. I don't think reincarnation is my cup of tea, he spoke after a while. Percy didn't say anything, respecting his host's decision. Heal my soul, the latter said. By now, the ringing in their ears had subsided somewhat, letting them hear the cube's next words more clearly. Accumulating soul mana. Healing begins in 6 writs. Though they'd been working towards this very moment for weeks, Percy was suddenly overcome by a wave of panic, realizing they were mere seconds away from parting for good. What was he even supposed to say to a friend he might never see again? A crisp sound broke him out of his thoughts, as something soft brushed through the air. The familiar feeling of a cool droplet landing on their forehead was soon followed by a refreshing sensation spreading through their soul. Wherever it passed, the cracks in Gabe's soul rapidly closed. Not wishing to waste their last few moments, Percy said the first thing that came to mind. I'm so sorry for leaving you behind in such a shitty state. Perhaps he should have gone with something more positive, but he did feel strongly about this. While Percy had only promised to do his best to help Gabe, returning to Remia without knowing whether he'd succeeded didn't sit well with him. Especially since he was leaving his friend crippled, and with a heavy secret to bear. However, a wave of amusement soon seeped through their bond. What are you apologizing for? Gabe asked. It's not your fault I got myself killed before we met. As far as I'm concerned, you're leaving me better than you found me. Another droplet fell, causing Percy's soul wisp to recede even further down the mending cracks. The patches he'd been struggling to hold together continued to fizzle out, no longer required. And as he started getting pushed out of the vessel, Percy noticed the pull of his main body had grown extremely strong, trying to pry him out of this world. But he wasn't thinking about that. His mind was focused on Gabe's words. Hearing his friend didn't blame him lifted a weight off Percy's chest. Then I suppose the only thing left is to wish you a quick recovery. And who knows? Maybe I'll visit again sooner or later. Gabe chuckled. As if it's so easy sneaking into this place. Hey, who do you think you're talking to? I'm the sneakiest guy in the universe. Percy snapped back in mock outrage. In fact, all I need is some kind of compass and I can stop wandering around blindly. He was part joking around, of course, though he did mean what he said. Percy fully intended to find a proper way of navigating the cosmos eventually. There already were 1 or 2 places he'd like to return to, and he was sure there would be even more in the future. And just like that, the 3rd droplet landed, the divine mana soon sealing the last few injuries in Gabe's soul, pushing Percy out. As the powerful cord on his back tensed, he was finally pulled away, as Gabe's final message echoed in his mind. Thanks, Percy. For everything. The moment Percy was dragged out of Gabe's body, and before he had the chance to pick up much speed, something strange happened. Bump! What the hell was that? Did I hit something, or did something else collide with me? It was weird because the only things he had ever interacted with in this disembodied state had been other souls. Plus, it had always been him running into them, if not intentionally then at least knowingly. Though he didn't think much of it, continuing on his way to Remia, not feeling any different after the collision. Instead, his thoughts were occupied by his recent experiences in the vault. While the place was positively rich with magical secrets, Percy had only managed to scratch the tip of the iceberg. Manuscript was arguably the vault's most valuable art, but he had lacked the funds and the time to study it too deeply. After all, he couldn't have asked his dying friend to waste his limited credits on books and tutorials for his sake. That stingy jellyfish wouldn't have agreed anyway. Consequently, leaving without learning how to inscribe a single rune was Percy's second greatest regret in this trip, only narrowly beaten by the bittersweet ending of Gabe's challenge. However, that was not to say he was without gains. I can't wait to apply everything we've learned about the Moirai. And soon enough, the wisp was back in its rightful body, the two sets of memories now blending into each other. The process took a little longer than usual, probably due to the greater volume of divergent memories he had to sift through. In fact, the memories themselves were fine, it wasn't very difficult to logically arrange them. The bigger issue were the emotions. As it turned out, Percy's clone and main body had developed some distinct feelings during their time apart, some of them even in conflict with one another. For example, the main body had spent several months compressing crystals, brewing elixirs, and working on the new recipe with Auron. Suffice to say, he'd grown a little fed up with alchemy by now. On the other hand, the clone had begun to miss it after the long vacation. So now that the two minds fused once more, Percy had to deal with all sorts of concurrent incongruities like that. By the time he was done, his head was throbbing, as he rested weakly on his bed. Only now did he remember it was the middle of the night. The clone's return had woken him up. Well, better than collapsing in Auron's house, I suppose. All in all, there had been plenty of interesting developments on both sides, so Percy planned to spend tomorrow rethinking his priorities. For now, he figured there was no better starting point than reading his status. Percival Avalon. Mana Cores. Mana Core 1, Orange, Soul. Mana Core 2, Red, Pure. Bloodline? Clone, create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity. Spells. Parting Gift, Crude. Secret Art, Familiar, Crude. Quarterstaff, Crude. Glove, Crude. Crystallization, Crude. Circulation, Refined. Decrees. Phoebe's Decree grants access to your status. Grants a bloodline. Moirai Decree grants a second mana core. Metatron's Decree open a one-way portal to the Vault of Magic at will. Percy's eyes widened upon reaching the end of his status, the new words carrying some shocking implications. When did this happen? He and Gabe had checked their status a few hours before starting the last wave of the challenge. The new decree definitely hadn't been there at the time. More importantly, this was something targeting Percy specifically, having followed him all the way home. It must be what bumped into me right when I was leaving. But what did this mean? Obviously, their secrets had been exposed to the upper echelons of the vault. Their hopes of hiding under the noses of a bunch of gods, while having all sorts of unusual interactions with the vault system had obviously been way too optimistic. Shit, what's going to happen now? Am I even safe here? Percy's heartbeat quickened as all sorts of catastrophic scenarios flashed through his mind. A few minutes later, he realized panic wasn't helping, so he grabbed his shaking wrist to calm himself down. Only now did he register his bedsheets were stuck to his skin, drenched in cold sweat. Let's not jump to conclusions. Metatron has clearly opted for a softer approach. The Titan could have chosen to appear before Percy at any point, forcibly capturing him, or performing all sorts of experiments on him against his will. Instead, he had remained silent, waiting for him to leave before passing him what was essentially an invitation. But why? The guy wasn't some sort of saint. Metatron was a callous man who had crafted one of the most brutal worlds Percy had ever heard of. Why would he care about the feelings of some random mortal? Though, thinking about it from the god's perspective, it did make sense. The most precious thing his clones possessed was the Moirai Decree. Of course, that was plenty valuable in and of itself, but Percy wasn't sure if Metatron could have snatched it by force. Maybe they could have tried extracting his soul from Gabe and placing it into a different body. However, he wasn't sure that would have worked. Perhaps he couldn't possess another body without using his ability first, or maybe they couldn't have fused his soul with somebody else's without his consent. Either way, it would have been a gamble. They'd have risked everything to maybe grant one more person a second core. But had they failed, they would have lost their chance forever. However, Percy's main body possessed something far more valuable, the very bloodline making all this possible in the first place. If they could get their hands on him, they could pass the Moirai Decree to as many people as they wanted. And who knew what else they could do with it? This is still a gamble on his part though. The rewards are higher, but so is the risk. Percy could always choose not to go. In that case, Metatron would lose everything. In fact, as much as he wanted to check up on his friend and to uncover more of the Vault's knowledge, Percy would be a fool to even consider it. These people treated their own children as disposable experiments. Who would be stupid enough to willingly place themselves at their mercy? But Metatron isn't an idiot. He obviously knows I would feel this way. Just what is his angle? Did he think Percy would eventually get into a situation where he'd have to use the decree? It was possible. After all, he was just a weak mortal. He wouldn't risk his life when he was safe, but what if he found himself cornered by a powerful enemy? Possible death was better than certain death, wasn't it? Did Metatron count on that happening sooner or later? Unless he doesn't even care about that. What if the decree lets him do something else, like invading Remir at will? The possibility sent a shiver down Percy's spine, but he quickly shook his head. It shouldn't be that easy. If it were, Metatron would have taken over the universe already. Besides, even if he could invade, it wasn't like Percy could do much to stop him. He had no idea how to get rid of the decree, and he wasn't selfless enough to kill himself or spill the beans to the Divine Order. Actually, that might be what he wants me to do. How would the gods react if they were to learn about all this? Perhaps, their safest bet would be to execute him on the spot. If things developed in such a way, he might be forced to escape to the vault in desperation. It's best not to do anything rash. I don't think I'm in any immediate danger. In fact, Gabe was the one in trouble. Shit! Gabe! Is he going to be all right? While Percy was by far the most valuable of the two, Gabe was still an important test subject. After all, Percy had already given him the decree. Could his children inherit his second core? If so, Percy could see the Vault's gods forcing Gabe to sire a lot of kids. Hopefully the decree doesn't propagate like that. They could also try snatching it from him the same way Percy had passed it along in the first place. Though that was likely impossible. If this hadn't been a unique feature of the clone bloodline, other races would have long stolen it from the Moirai. Soul affinities were rare, yes, but still abundant at the cosmic scale. It was the combination of Percy's affinity and bloodline that was probably unprecedented. With any luck, they'll treat him as a valuable asset. It wasn't hard to imagine. The Vault's deities were certainly self-centered, but also logical. Gabe had already been a Yellowborn with a blessing and a useful bloodline before Percy's interference. He was one of the chosen few they had kept around in the first place. Now, his value had gone up again. Perhaps they'd treat him kindly, investing in him rather than squeezing him dry of all he was worth. And not just due to his own potential, but also as a bargaining chip to use against Percy in the future. Either way, I can't do anything about it as I am. Percy couldn't help but lament his powerlessness once again. And it was more pronounced than ever before, now that he found himself opposite a titan of all people. But at least, Metatron didn't seem like he was planning to move against him directly anytime soon. He was probably playing the long game. Or at least, Percy had no alternative but to assume as much. Thinking of a possibility, he grinned. Then, I guess I can play games too. Percy tried, and failed, to get some more sleep following his clone's return. His insomnia was largely a symptom of his stress. He couldn't help but glance around the room every few seconds, fully expecting to see Metatron standing there, smirking at him. Only when the sun rose did Percy finally shake off his rampant paranoia. Of course, logic had told him hours ago he'd most likely be all right, but it wasn't until the warm rays snuck past the curtains, gently caressing his face, that he managed to put his worry to rest. Though, the new decree hadn't been the only thing keeping him awake. There was more, some of it even being good news. While he'd been exhausted after another day of brewing, he was always a little reinvigorated whenever a clone returned. The missing soul fragments tended to fill him with energy as they settled in their rightful place. And to top it all off, today was special in more ways than one. It's finally happening. Percy struggled to contain his bubbling enthusiasm. Through an amusing stroke of luck, the end of his trip had coincided with another important development. The first strands of orange had appeared in Percy's second core the day before. Estimating that around 12 hours had passed since the last dose, he sat cross-legged on the bed, before stretching his arm to grab a gemstone vial from the nightstand. Pop! Ptui. Naturally, Percy didn't miss a beat, uncorking it and spitting out the lid with a single motion, gulping its contents down before the cork even landed on the floor. And as soon as the elixir settled in his stomach, he drew some mana from his abdomen, swirling the two substances together with practiced ease. Only when the deattuned beast mana finished bonding to his own did he begin circulating them back and forth to his second core. Percy activated Mana Sense, watching as wave upon wave of mana washed over the crystalline walls. Usually, one didn't need to directly observe the purification process, but he wouldn't miss this moment for the world. Whenever he pulled the mixture inwards, it chipped away at some of the dimmer red segments, causing his abdomen to itch. And every time he pushed the mana outwards, the impurities were the first to go, leaving the ethereal organ a little emptier, though its contents purer. At the beginning, only a single new strand appeared during each revolution. At that speed, it would take several days for the promotion to be completed. Luckily, it didn't work like that, as the purification rate tended to snowball as one inched closer to the finish line. 2 strands appeared together during the 4th cycle, while 5 of them popped up at once by the 10th. However, it was still a bit slow. It's not going to be enough, Percy couldn't help but crack a bitter smile. The advancement was around halfway complete, though the elixir in his stomach was already nearly exhausted. Not that it was the end of the world. Far from it. It just meant he'd have to complete the promotion in the evening. He'd already waited years for this moment, he could wait a few more hours. But it's a little anticlimactic. Accepting it simply wasn't meant to be, he watched the last traces of elixir about to be consumed. Yet, something suddenly changed. At first, a single new strand appeared. It wasn't enough to fill the core by itself, but that was only the beginning. Having crossed some kind of threshold, the newcomer soon attracted its neighbors, as the pure lines of orange mana twisted together, forming a thicker band. And it seemed to exert some influence on the smaller ones, starting a chain reaction. More of them joined together, as the thicker ropes also began attracting one another. Yet there was some final barrier preventing those from merging. They tried to, but couldn't take the last step, causing them to swirl around the organ even more violently than before. Their ends lashed out against the walls of the core, scraping more impurities out. This caused Percy's abdomen to burn more intensely than it usually did after a purification session. Of course, he didn't panic. Having experienced this before, he knew what to expect. As the thicker ropes purified the core, they allowed more of the thinner ones to appear. With nowhere to go, they had no choice but to merge, much like their predecessors had done mere moments ago. The situation kept escalating, until the core was filled with only thick bands before long. By now, the orange color had overwhelmingly dominated the red, leaving no more space for new strands to form. This seemed to push the reaction to its final stage, as the densely packed ropes overcame the barrier, fusing together. The rest happened too fast for Percy to register. With a satisfying sound reverberating through his body, all his core's contents fused into a singular blob of orange, splashing down at the bottom of the organ. The new mana was a lot denser than before, only filling up about a third of the volume. Though that could easily be fixed. Taking a few deep breaths, Percy quickly replenished his reserves over the next couple of minutes, as a potent wave of vitality washed over his body and soul, elevating every inch of his existence. His senses grew sharper, letting him observe details in the room he'd never quite noticed before. His thoughts became clearer, as time even seemed to slow down a little. But the greatest improvement was to his physical strength, as his muscles twitched, their fibers coursing with new vigor. "I'll never get tired of this." Advancing to a higher grade was easily the greatest joy for a mage, comfortably beating even the exhilaration felt after mastering a new spell. It was something most people would only get to experience a few times in their life. Well, highborns like Elaine might do it a couple more, but they also tended to live much longer, so it averaged out. Either way, Percy got to enjoy the rare privilege of going through each milestone twice. And it hasn't even been 5 years yet. The thought reminded him to grab a bowl of cyan powder he'd prepared on the nightstand before going to bed. Dripping a splash of water from a nearby cup, he hastily mixed the two materials into paste before downing it. It hadn't been that long since he began using the miraculous substance, but it had already proven its worth, having shaved several months off his advancement time. In fact, he'd probably just set a brand new record, unbeknownst to anyone, for the fastest promotion on Remia. Furthermore, it would probably become even more effective when he and Oren finalized the new recipe, fully integrating the cyan powder into the elixirs. Something they were extremely close to doing. But not today. Percy had already notified his mentor he was going to take the day off. After all, he had a new toy he couldn't wait to play around with. And it wasn't even just for fun. He did need to get used to how his spells felt after the advancement, to avoid any surprises in case he ended up in a fight. Furthermore, this promotion would have a significant impact on his ability to condense the crystals, hopefully letting him produce more of them per day. Right now, he could still barely keep up with his needs, but he had to greatly increase his output if he wanted to make money off the new elixirs. I suppose it's time to pay my good old friends, the Starry Soldiers, a visit. It had been around a year since Percy made the switch to full-time alchemy. Suffice to say, his combat skills had probably grown a little rusty, making this a great opportunity to get in shape again. He could put his new power to the test, while also stretching his limbs. Leaping to his feet, he took a couple minutes to wash up, before grabbing another dose of elixir and paste for the road. Leaving his house, he sent a message to his familiar. "Morning, buddy. I'm on the way to the spire. Man, I've actually missed you." CAW, the crow sent him a questioning sound back. From the bird's perspective, they'd only met a couple days ago. Well, technically the same was true for Percy, but he was still sorting through his conflicting emotions. "It's complicated," he said, not bothering to explain. A few hours later, Percy stood on a giant mushroom, with Mickey sitting a few meters away. The former took deep breaths, appreciating the colorful motes boosting his regeneration. Of course, they had them in the settlement too, but fewer made it indoors where he spent most of his time. It was nice getting some fresh air for a change. Around 36 paces ahead, a wasp the size of a man was strolling carelessly atop the colossal fungus, completely oblivious to the grim fate that awaited it. Two sets of glowing lines thrummed underneath Percy's skin as he cracked his fists, eagerly eyeing his prey. "Well then?" The soldier stabbed repeatedly with its stinger, trying to poke holes into Percy's brain. Though the latter didn't have much difficulty dodging. "I can't believe I even missed the scent of their acid," he thought, sniffing the acrid odor, unbothered by the slight burning sensation in his nostrils. Okay, perhaps he needed to get out of the lab more. Brewing non-stop was clearly driving him insane. In any case, Percy had yet to summon any of his weapons, nor had he used a spell other than circulation. Maybe it was a little reckless of him, taking on a beast a full grade higher barehanded, especially right after such a long break from hunting. That said, his newly sharpened reflexes seemed to carry him just fine. Not that he wasn't a little out of shape, yet it wasn't nearly as bad as he'd expected. Fighting alongside Gabe over the past month must have helped. While Percy had only been in partial control of his friend's body, and while his host's style had been very different to his own, they'd still faced off against elite opponents at Green. That was a level Percy wasn't even remotely ready to touch by himself. Evidently, the experience had been more than a little eye-opening. But why does this feel off? He'd already casually evaded dozens of lunges, his agility having grown to a monstrous level following the promotion. The wasp even showed signs of tiring by now. Yet, Percy just couldn't shake this irritating feeling he wasn't giving it his all. Weird. I'm using both instances of circulation at maximum output. Oblivious to his thoughts, the insect suddenly disengaged, flying a little higher. Percy wasn't surprised, having expected it to resort to this move sooner or later. He tensed his calves, preparing for the incoming attack. Probably realizing it was outmatched, the wasp didn't hold back, desperately releasing all its venom at once. 3 blobs of purple spread above Percy. Yet it only took him 2 steps to escape the splash zone, comfortably leaping out of the expanding shadows with plenty of time to spare. SSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSSS satisfied him. However, it only exacerbated the feeling there was something more. It simmered beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. I suppose the advancement has opened a new door for me. Can I push circulation even further? Putting some distance from the bug, he turned his senses inwards. This arrangement suited the wasp fine, as it wasn't in a hurry to follow, instead taking the opportunity to recover a little. But Percy didn't care about his cowardly opponent, his focus now entirely on the ethereal organ in his abdomen. The core was filled to the brim with mana, as more kept flowing in and out to his channels. In fact, the pathways were all stretched to their limits too, making them unable to accommodate another drop. Or well, that should have been the case. However, they didn't seem quite as strained as usual upon further examination. Shifting his gaze towards the one in his sternum, he noticed the same phenomenon happening in the second set of channels. The flow coursing through them was about as potent as it normally was, yet he felt he could push it further if he really tried. Strange. Is it because both my cores are at the same grade now? The interesting thing about circulation was it both strengthened one's body and required it to be stronger. That was why Percy had needed to exercise for several months before he could use it. It was all about finding the highest stable level at which the spell could operate without harming him. But what happened if a mage had 2 cores and just as many instances of circulation? Let's find out. Taking another breath, Percy pushed more pure mana into his abdomen, forcing it into the corresponding channels. He encountered a lot of resistance, his whole body hurt, but the pathways ultimately swelled a little further to accommodate his wishes. Next, he repeated the process with soul mana, which was even more painful. He couldn't help but wince as the maelstrom swirled more violently, carving nasty grooves in his soul. But it held. Percy paused for a moment to examine his body. Overall, the gains were minuscule, hardly worth the trouble so far. That said, he couldn't help but notice his channels felt slightly less saturated once more. Is this some sort of positive feedback loop between the 2 cores? Core! Mickey called out to him, a trace of worry worming its way into his voice. Don't worry, buddy. I'm being careful. Over the next few minutes, Percy continued to push his body further and further, one tiny step at a time. Eventually, there seemed to be no more room for improvement, as both sets of channels settled at their new upper limit. Only then did Percy stop using mana sense, examining himself through his eyes. His muscles had swollen even more than they usually did, his flesh now painted a deep crimson color. His veins throbbed, as the glow from the cyan and silver lines was almost blinding. And most curiously, motes of mana leaked out of his pores about as fast as they were being replenished, giving his skin a magical sheen, shrouding his body in a dual halo. Ooh, this is going to take some getting used to. Everything ached, from head to toe. Not just his flesh, but his soul too. And that was without even mentioning how taxing it was on his mind. While Percy could normally use circulation all day long, he'd be lucky if he could keep this version up for a couple of hours. Another project to work towards, I guess. Still, he couldn't help but crack a smile, eager to put this power to the test. He stretched his limbs and flexed his muscles, hearing all sorts of popping sounds coming from his joints. Then he took a step forward. BZZZZZZZ. The starry soldier had spent the last few minutes staring at him cautiously, but it appeared to have run out of patience, Percy's current appearance scaring it out of its mind. It turned around without missing a beat, fleeing at top speed, leaving Percy staring at its back with his mouth agape. Seriously? Come back here, he yelled, running after it. At first, the wasp looked like it was going to get away, it was a fast one even among yellow beasts. It also didn't help Percy's steps were measured, as he was careful not to overexert his body before understanding his limits. However, he didn't need to be so cautious, as the spell seemed to work as advertised. It greatly boosted both his mobility and resilience, letting him easily keep up with the creature, accelerating with each stride. Before long, he was confidently gaining ground on the bug, leaving it no choice but to fly upwards, trying to escape to the sky. As if I'll let you. Percy quickly formed a silver sickle before throwing it above the creature, blocking its path. The chase went on for a little longer as he drew nearer and nearer, tossing projectiles at his prey whenever it tried taking an inconvenient turn. Eventually, the wasp understood it wasn't going to get away, suddenly turning around to land a sneaky stab in Percy's eye. But the young man grinned, his passive soul vision having already warned him. With some elegant footwork, he pivoted around the giant insect, soon finding himself staring at it from behind. Before the beast could even tell what was happening, he jumped to its back, stepping on its smooth exoskeleton, grabbing a membranous wing with each hand. The starry soldier crash-landed on the giant mushroom, sliding along its surface for about a dozen meters before coming to a halt. It struggled weakly for a few moments, trying to shake Percy off. Not particularly bothered, he took his time pulling out the thin plates of chitin held in his palms. At some point, the insect did manage to shake him off, but only because his footing loosened after ripping the wings out of their sockets. Next, the creature pounced on him, the two rolling atop the giant fungus engaged in a slugfest. Of course, Percy could easily put an end to this charade at any point with a parting gift. But he didn't. He wanted to savor his new spell, exploring the limits of his physical strength. He dodged the bug's sharp mandibles, ignoring the putrid droplets of spittle they spread every time they moved. With every opportunity, he tore out another of the wasp's limbs, slowly wrestling the beast to the ground, ripping it apart inch by inch. Eventually, he stood alone amidst a sticky pool of green, filled with severed chunks of bug flesh. His face and hands were covered in the substance too, though his robes had done their job once more, the enchanted fabric looking about as immaculate as it had earlier that morning. Percy breathed hard, the fight, or at least the way in which he'd stubbornly chosen to conduct it, having taken its toll on him. Yet his face beamed with a radiant smile as he reveled in his new strength. And only now did the status see fit to announce his latest accomplishment. Neat! Strictly speaking, synchronization was only classified as refined, like circulation. However, this was still impressive in many ways. Generally, the status avoided registering an upgrade within the same class unless the spell in question was a qualitative improvement over its predecessor. Though I hope it's compatible with the dance. Of course, Percy didn't know how to get his hands on the final step of the technique. The only clue Mickey had left him was it had something to do with ambient mana, but that wasn't much to go with. That said, he hoped he wouldn't have to choose between that and synchronization. Core! The crow landed next to him, diving into the mess of wasp parts. It tossed the bigger chunks away with its beak, occasionally swallowing one of the smaller pieces, while searching for the core. Wow, you could at least pretend to be excited over my new spell. Percy complained in a faux-offended tone. Though Mickey just ignored him. Only after the familiar was done eating did the two head back to the settlement. They took their sweet time catching up, as they weren't in a rush, wanting to make the most of this rare vacation while it lasted. At some point, I'll need to teach him how to speak. Due to his unique circumstances, Mickey was more than smart enough to learn the language. Communicating via feelings and images was certainly convenient, but it wouldn't hurt to have the ability to talk to other people. Well, assuming his physiology even allowed it. It'll be easier after his next advancement. Plus, I'm a little swamped right now. Percy sighed. His original goal for today had been to test his entire kit, though his overindulgence in his new toy had left his body battered and sore, forcing him to leave earlier. It was a bit of a bummer, especially since he also looked forward to fusing his affinities. I suppose I'll have to try that some other time. Once they approached the bridges leading to the ground level, they finally parted ways. Entering the guild, Percy headed straight to Freddy's stand, waving at the plump vendor as soon as he came into view. The latter waved back absent-mindedly at first, though his eyes widened upon noticing Percy's condition. Holy shit! What happened to you? I got in a messy situation out there, Percy replied vaguely. However, upon seeing the color fade from his friend's face, he hurriedly added, But don't worry about it. I'm not injured. Just tired, and filthy, and very, very hungry. The response seemed to calm Freddy down, though the man still raised an eyebrow. Since when did you return to hunting anyway? I thought you switched to alchemy a while ago. Percy shrugged. I did. I was on a break today. Freddy chuckled, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't until a moment later he seemed to realize Percy wasn't kidding. Seriously? Who goes hunting on their break? He asked in exasperation. Man, you should really get yourself a hobby. Percy didn't take any offense, knowing the guy was just looking out for him. You know what they say. Happy is the man who turns his hobby into a profession. Oh? Is that what you did? Turned your hobby into a profession? Freddy scoffed. Well, not exactly. Percy admitted, before grinning. But I think I'm close to turning my former profession into a hobby. Freddy rolled his eyes, though Percy didn't miss the subtle smile tugging at his pal's lips. Anyway. You're here for the usual, I assume? Freddy asked, changing the topic. Percy nodded before passing him a brown chip. Freddy handed him the honey roll, grimacing as he tried and failed to wipe the grime off the change. Percy didn't pay him much attention, his focus soon shifting to his snack. Pouncing on it like a famished wolf, he'd already devoured half of it by the time his friend finished cleaning the coin. Wow! It's almost like you didn't have one last night. Freddy said, getting another shrug back. A few minutes later, Percy arrived at his house. Though he'd been too tired to keep fighting the bugs, it was still bright outside, so he wasn't going to bed just yet. There was something else he wanted to figure out before returning to work tomorrow. After taking a quick shower, he sat on the floor, pulling some pure mana out of his abdomen. He'd shaven a lot of time off crystallization over the last year, but each marble still took him over an hour to make, which wasn't ideal. Let's see how much faster I can do it now. First, without circulation. Forming the cyan blob between his hands, he exerted all his strength, pressing down on it with physical and magical might alike. Normally, Percy hated producing the crystals more than anything else he'd done over the years. It was no less exhausting than his most difficult fights, and even more monotonous than alchemy. At least when brewing elixirs, every batch was unique, making the process interactive and somewhat engaging. This, instead, was sitting still for hours on end, doing the exact same thing over and over. In fact, he couldn't even think about something else to distract himself. The tedious task required nothing short of his full attention and willpower. Of course, he didn't really have a choice. It wasn't the first sacrifice he'd had to make during his magical journey, nor would it be the last. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this on my day off though. Then again, this was a special occasion. The mere idea of evaluating his gains post-advancement filled him with anticipation, breathing some fresh air into the stale process. The sphere continued to shrink as Percy kept pushing. He felt no different than when he usually did it, he was just as tired, his body drenched in sweat. Yet, the results spoke for themselves. Pop! Wow, that was much faster indeed. He wiped his forehead with his arm, his chest heaving up and down. Perhaps he shouldn't have been in a rush to take a shower before starting. Though having to wash up twice was definitely preferable to getting wasp goo all over his room. Around 40 minutes, give or take, he estimated, pinching the cyan marble between his thumb and index finger. Then, he grinned. I've finally beaten her. Having a one-sided competition against a sick old lady struggling to provide for her village admittedly wasn't Percy's classiest moment. Especially since the poor woman hadn't the slightest idea some random kid across the cosmos had set her as a personal goal to surpass. But hey, Percy thought being a little competitive was one of his better traits. It motivated him to keep improving. Plus, he wasn't hurting anybody. In any case, the experiment wasn't over yet. In fact, the main event had yet to begin. Taking a few deep breaths, he activated circulation with both cores, though he didn't push it beyond the usual limit. For now, this was the state he'd be using most of the time while compressing the crystals, at least until he grew more accustomed to synchronization. Repeating the process once more, he soon ended up with a second marble in his palm. 20 minutes. It was good. Over 3 times faster than before the promotion, which was definitely going to help once the new recipe was complete. However, Percy wasn't done. While he still had to iron the kinks out of his latest spell, he just couldn't wait to put it to the test. Retracing his actions from earlier that morning, he incrementally raised the intensity of the 2 instances of circulation until his channels couldn't fit any more mana. Realizing the process had taken him a while, he frowned. I'll have to work on the activation time too, not just the endurance. I can't afford to spend this long in a fight. But that was a problem for the future. Manifesting another blob between his hands, he quickly began the compression process again, soon beating his record for the 3rd time that day. 15 minutes. The difference wasn't huge, but Percy knew an opportunity when he saw it. If he spent as long as possible making the marbles with synchronization active, he'd not only increase his output a little, but it would also help him get used to the new spell, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Great! Efficiency is king, he smiled, though his expression soon soured. Now that his end of the manufacturing process was settled, he had a few more obstacles to deal with, standing between him and untold riches. On the bright side, Metatron still hasn't kidnapped me. The bluish-green concoction stopped boiling, giving Percy a moment of reprieve. But he couldn't relax for long. The mixture was currently unstable, so delaying could easily cause the yield to suffer. Moving quickly, he grabbed a pinch of ground leaves he'd prepared earlier, tossing the colorful dust in the cauldron. Next, he turned up the temperature much higher than before, stirring it again. The rainbow grass seems to work, Oren exclaimed as he watched it bubble. Upon learning of the cyan paste's ability to mend one's core, Percy had been trying to incorporate it directly into the elixirs, aiming to maximize its effectiveness. The first additional step had been relatively simple. He'd only needed to mix the powder with a finished elixir. Naturally, it had involved some heating and stirring, much like the previous steps. That had allowed the crystallized mana to bond with the beast mana already present. And of course, this hadn't been very complicated, so Percy had actually succeeded on his first try. However, the resulting elixir hadn't worked as intended. The moment he added his own mana to the concoction, it reacted violently inside his stomach, nearly injuring him. After some reflection, the problem had become clear. The recipe for the regular elixirs involved 3 stages, commonly referred to as the 3 pillars of alchemy. First, the pacification step delayed the activation of the beast mana, allowing the elixir to work gradually over several minutes rather than surging through the mage's body all at once. During the redirection step, the beast mana was modified to target impurities more strongly than the rest of the core, enhancing the elixir's purifying effects. Finally, the deattunement step allowed the beast mana to blend more easily with the first new type of mana it encountered, so that it could be guided through the user's channels. And this was exactly where the problem lied. It was precisely because of deattunement that the cyan powder could bond with the beast mana. However, that meant the elixir was no longer deattuned afterwards. Of course, the solution had been rather obvious too. Since the deattunement was used up after adding the cyan powder, all Percy had to do was deattune it a second time. Essentially, the new recipe required 5 steps now: pacification, redirection, deattunement, bonding, and then deattunement again. Though that came with its own set of challenges. To start, the same ingredient used for the first round of deattunement couldn't be used again. At least not without massively impacting the yield and quality of the elixir. In fact, the same was true for the overall procedure. Percy and Oren had discovered it was best to perform the second deattunement at a much higher temperature. That meant they'd needed to modify the procedure, fine-tuning everything to accommodate the changes. Furthermore, not all ingredients could handle the increased heat, greatly narrowing down their options. Ground rainbow grass was simply the most recent in a long string of experiments. "It's done," Percy said once the mixture settled into a turquoise gel. Distilling the contents of the cauldron into a vial was a struggle, his hands shaking from excitement. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need to make sure it works first," Oren said, though Percy didn't miss the grin on his mentor's face. Stretching out his arm, he offered him the experimental product, but the old alchemist shook his head. "You do the honors. It's your recipe," Oren said. It was true. Percy had led the whole endeavor, testing all the provisional iterations by himself. As for his mentor, he'd only taken on a supporting role, giving him tips and advice whenever he got stuck. "Bottoms up then," he said, before gulping down the liquid. It tasted just as bitter as the regular elixirs. At least, the second round of deattunement seemed to have done its job, his soul mana easily blending with the substance, guiding it to his core with no issues. And the moment it reached the ethereal organ, it behaved in a very peculiar way. His sternum both burned and itched at the same time. The exotic substance washed over the core's walls, chipping away at the impurities, mending the resulting scars right afterwards. It was somehow even more unpleasant than the regular elixirs. While the damage it left behind was greatly reduced, the dual action of the two materials was rather intense. That was in stark contrast to the refreshing effect of the cyan paste Percy had grown fond of over the past year. "Well?" Oren impatiently asked about half an hour later. Only then did Percy shift his gaze back to his mentor, remembering he was still in the latter's lab. "I guess we'll have to wait a few hours to make sure, but I believe it works." "How effective do you think it is?" Percy spent a few moments gauging the state of his core. It was better than if he'd used the elixir and paste separately, though it was hard to estimate exactly by how much. "I think I'll be able to drink 3 of these per day," he ultimately concluded. The old alchemist drew a sharp breath, clearly finding Percy's assessment difficult to accept. Perhaps, he wouldn't have been so surprised if his student had come clean about the details of the cyan powder and paste. Percy had actually held back a lot of information about the substance. For example, he'd yet to disclose where he got it from, nor had he told Oren it could be used even without fusing it into the elixirs. Obviously, the old alchemist wasn't dumb, he could tell Percy hadn't been entirely honest. Though they'd tacitly agreed to postpone their inevitable argument for after the recipe was perfected. Which, unfortunately, was now. Pulling a couple of chairs from a nearby desk, Oren moved one close to Percy, before sitting on the other. "Percy, you know we have to talk about this, right?" The young man shrugged, taking a seat. "To be honest, I'm surprised you didn't bring it up before now. I considered it. But to tell you the truth, I wasn't entirely convinced by your claim you could improve the elixirs. It sounded too good to be true. That said, this has been a fun project, so I figured I'd indulge you and see where it went." Percy remained silent for a while, contemplating his mentor's words. The latter's explanation was pretty much in line with his guess. "Now what?" "You know where I stand, don't you?" he asked. "I imagine you want to keep this knowledge to yourself. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been so secretive in the first place." Oren said, getting a nod back. "Yes. I need this. I'm just a Redborn. I worked hard for a chance to catch up to my peers." But the old alchemist shook his head. "You understand me well enough too." "I can't agree with that." "Of course not." Oren was too nice and too principled to hold back such a huge breakthrough from the rest of Remia. It was why Percy had been dreading this conversation. In fact, he would have tried modifying the recipe on his own if it had been an option. Sadly, he'd need years to accomplish that without help. Oren smiled bitterly. "Son, I know it's not fair. You did work hard for this. But this is bigger than you or I. Our whole world can benefit from this knowledge. Everyone will reach higher grades. We'll get more violet cores. More gods." Percy clenched his fists. "I care about Remia. Believe me, I do. And I get how important this is. If some faction invades us, this recipe might make the difference between everyone I know surviving or getting enslaved," he said. It was the same conundrum he had about sharing any of the other gains his clones brought back. Though this was a little different. It was easier to claim he'd accidentally stumbled upon the cyan powder. That wasn't the case with an intricate spell like circulation or the Moire decree. "But I need to think about myself too. Nobody else will. I'm currently at the bottom of the barrel. This can help me climb higher. Even if Remia was the strongest world in the universe, it won't mean a damn thing when a random noble steps on me like a bug. Oren placed his hand on Percy's shoulder, gently squeezing it. Kid, even if we publicize the new elixirs, you'll still benefit from them. I'll make sure you do. If you can't afford them without my help, I'll brew you some personally. If you don't want people to know you came up with the recipe, I'll pretend it was my idea. No matter what, I promise I won't let you suffer a loss. Percy felt a fuzzy feeling in his chest. Oren had already done so much for him. He'd mentored him, sponsored him, and even helped him with the new recipe. Now he was offering to shield him from all the repercussions too. Still, it's not that simple. Power is relative. If everyone gets an advantage, then nobody does. Besides, it's not just about the advancement speed. I was planning to monetize the new recipe. I need the funds. Percy's voice trailed off. He couldn't tell Oren about Mickey or the enlightenment potions. As much as the man cared about him, his reaction would be the same. And unlike the cyan powder, none of his other secrets were safe to leak. With this, he could at least cut his losses if things went downhill. At worst, he'd miss out on a potential advantage. But the rest could actually endanger him. Oren was about to say something, but Percy raised a hand to stop him. Flashing him a resolute look, he made an offer. How about this? Give me a head start. Just 200 years. With the new elixirs, I can advance a couple of times by then. After that, you can share the recipe with whomever you like. The old alchemist didn't immediately decline, which was good news. All things considered, it wasn't a terrible suggestion. 2 centuries might be a long time for a young man like Percy. However, it wasn't much for the leader of a great house or a god of the divine order. Though, Oren shook his head in the end. Normally centuries come and go without much happening at the cosmic scale. But we could still get unlucky. Remember the incident with the lotus a couple years ago? It was a good thing, yet it could easily go differently next time. Percy's expression fell, thinking his mentor wouldn't agree. Suffice to say, his heart skipped a beat when the man ultimately extended his hand. 20 years. That's the highest I'm willing to go. It's still a gamble, but I suppose you deserve that much. In the end, Percy shook his mentor's hand, the weight of their agreement settling between them. 20 years were just a touch more than he needed to reach yellow. It wasn't that much in the grand scheme of things, but he hoped his clones would bring back some additional advantages in that time. While the deadline added a tinge of pressure on his shoulders, he understood the enormity of Oren's concession. Wanting to show his gratitude for everything the old alchemist had done, Percy offered to brew the new elixirs for him. The man was already at blue, which would have normally been his upper limit as an orange-born. However, thanks to the new recipe, he now stood a real chance of reaching violet in his lifetime. Yet his mentor's response surprised Percy. There's no need for that, Oren said with a dismissive wave. The whole point of this 20-year delay is to give you a head start. If I had you tied up brewing elixirs for me, it would defeat the purpose. Besides, I'll still need nearly 2,000 years to advance. A couple of decades aren't going to make that much of a difference. Percy was moved by his mentor's words. Especially because he knew it wasn't as simple as Oren had made it sound. 20 years saved before his promotion would translate to 60 afterwards. Over half a century. Even for a powerful mage, it was still a sizable amount of time to just give up on. But he didn't insist, mainly because he understood he wouldn't be able to deliver anyway. After all, he was planning to leave the guild in a couple years. So instead, he tried to make it up to Oren by sharing the details about the cyan powder, explaining how somebody with a pure affinity could condense the crystals. That way, the old alchemist could look for another way to brew the elixirs by himself. Of course, Percy still left a few things out. As much as he trusted Oren, there was no reason to tell him how he'd stumbled upon this discovery, nor did he need to reveal the existence of his second core. Instead, he said he had a friend helping him get the powder. In any case, this exchange solved most of Percy's immediate problems. The recipe was finally complete, and he'd successfully negotiated an acceptable deal with Oren. Yet, there remained one final obstacle to overcome. And it's the toughest one. It was already a struggle preparing 4 doses of elixir and cyan paste per day. Plus, he required even more now that he could consume them every 8 hours. Not to mention the points he needed to afford Mickey's potions. Suffice to say, his only path forward was to commercialize the new recipe. Sadly, he had no experience trading, nor did he think he'd manage to learn the art anytime soon. He also had no connections, meaning he'd have a difficult time finding a customer by himself. Especially since he had to do it without alerting others. He did ask Oren if he could help, but the man always dealt with the guild's official stores directly, whether to purchase materials or sell his products. Regrettably, the old alchemist couldn't be of much assistance in these shady ventures. Consequently, Percy had no choice but to place his trust in one more person. I wonder if she even remembers me. Of course, he was thinking about Nesha. Though he didn't know her that well, and some of her personality traits would probably make her a little difficult to work with, it wasn't like he had any other options. At least, she clearly had a good business sense, having established herself quite nicely over the past couple of years. Furthermore, their limited interactions had given him the impression she was honest. More importantly, Percy had learned some more information about her since their last meeting. While he hadn't been aware of her lie detection bloodline originally, it wasn't exactly some great secret. Nesha actively publicized it upon establishing her gambling den, presumably to build up prestige. And the gossip had eventually reached Percy's ears too, mainly thanks to Freddy. If nothing else, this ability of hers would help them gauge whether their future business partners could be trusted. What's up with the queue, though? There was quite a crowd waiting outside the building, all of them surprisingly quiet. The corner of Percy's mouth twitched at the sight. Hey, doesn't she live next door? Have you guys tried knocking? He asked a random guy in a yellow robe. SHHHHHH, the latter replied, placing his index finger over his lips. Then, he pointed at a sign propped up against the building. In typical Nesha fashion, the words were written sloppily, and she hadn't even bothered nailing the sign to the wall properly. Gambling den. Anybody who bothers me at home will be banned for life. Percy failed to suppress a chuckle. Seriously? Has she actually banned people before? The guy seemed taken aback by the question. Keep your voice down, he hissed, before pointing at a different sign, a few meters away from the first one. This one was also propped up, but at least the handwriting was much neater. In fact, it seemed to have been authored by multiple people, none of them being Nesha. Upon closer examination, it contained a list of names, each written slightly differently to the one above, probably added on different occasions. Percy raised an eyebrow. Wow! Did all those people get banned just for knocking on her door? Well, most of them. Though a few were rude to her or tried to cheat. Okay, perhaps the last 2 transgressions did warrant the treatment, but not the first one. Looking up at the sky, Percy noticed the sun was still just a little below its apex, partially obscured by the thick cloud of colorful motes descending from the spire. It was early afternoon. Nesha should have opened by now, yet she was clearly content chilling at home instead. Not just that, but she'd apparently gone to great lengths to ensure nobody would disturb her. Why do you guys even put up with this nonsense? The guy shrugged. What else are we supposed to do? This place is pretty much the only source of entertainment around here. Percy scratched the back of his neck. Well, why doesn't anybody else try opening a gambling den then? But the guy shook his head. Some people have tried, but it's not so easy. Obviously, you need to rent a building for this sort of thing. A street stand isn't very suitable. Unfortunately, due to the high rent for independent businesses in the guild, you need to manage things really well for it to survive. Hearing the man's words, Percy's expression was mixed. On one hand, he couldn't help but be impressed that Nesha had achieved so much in so little time. Though her ruthless nonchalance towards her clientele was more than a little concerning. As was the prospect of collaborating with her. I guess I'm not here to gamble anyway, he thought, casually walking towards her front door. The crowd drew sharp breaths, seemingly shocked by his boldness. Many stepped away from Percy, presumably to dissociate themselves from him. He didn't miss the disdainful looks aimed his way either. What's even the big deal? I just want to talk to her. Knock, knock. Looking back, he noticed their expressions growing even more incredulous after he dared to go through with it. Shaking his head, he turned back towards the door, waiting a few seconds. No response. Percy was a little more forceful the second time. Knock. Knock. Nesha. I know you're in there. Yet it wasn't until a couple minutes and twice as many escalating knocks later that the door finally opened. Can you idiots not read a simple sign? She asked in an irritated tone. It was a little funny actually. Percy could tell she was annoyed enough she wanted to yell, but raising her voice was too much of a bother for her. Luckily, her expression did seem to ease ever so slightly upon failing to recognize him as one of her regular customers. Hey, I'm really sorry for the intrusion, but Percy started speaking, though he cut himself off after thinking of something. Looking around, he saw the crowd still staring at them curiously. Dialing down his voice, he shielded his mouth, muttering his next words as softly as he could manage, making sure nobody but Nesha heard them. I have a business proposal for you. I promise it'll be worth your time. Nesha narrowed her eyes, staring at him silently for a few seconds. I remember you, she eventually said. You're the guy who wrote me a new sign a while back. I can't recall your name though. It's Per. She raised a hand to stop him. I don't care. You interrupted me in the middle of a nice bowl of strawberries. I'll let it slide this once, but if you have something to tell me, wait until I open shop. Bang! And just like that, she slammed the door right in Percy's face, leaving him staring with his mouth agape. Hey, at least you didn't get banned, some guy consoled him a few seconds later. Percy frowned. It's going to be so much fun working with her. Nesha remained holed up in her house for a couple hours, much to the crowd's dismay. She did walk out eventually, casually strolling towards the building next door, yawning along the way. Everyone but Percy quickly masked the frustration in their expressions, unwilling to risk pissing her off. As eager as Percy was to approach her, he decided to blend with the others at first, waiting patiently for the opportune moment. Nesha finally opened the gambling den, letting her customers inside. Only after everyone was sitting at different tables, engaging in various games involving dice or cards, did Percy grab the chance to talk to her. About that thing I mentioned earlier, he started saying, before she interrupted him. You're really keen on this, aren't you? She rolled her eyes. Percy frowned. Shouldn't you be too? I told you it's going to be worth your time. And you know I'm telling the truth. I know you believe that. If I had a brown chip every time somebody made a similar claim, I wouldn't have needed to open the gambling den in the first place. Realizing she was going to take some convincing, and also understanding this wasn't the place to make a scene, Percy opted for a subtler approach. He handed her a small pouch, before speaking. Look, words are cheap. Open it when you're back at home and try out the thing inside. In private. I swear it's safe. I've included instructions on how to use it. We'll discuss the rest later. Seeing her accept it, Percy left the building. He genuinely had no clue how Nesha would react to the new elixir. Its value would definitely speak for itself, but that still wasn't a guarantee she'd be willing to collaborate with him. Perhaps she wouldn't want to take the risk, or she'd be too lazy to bother. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, I suppose. Returning home, he spent the rest of the day compressing crystals. It appeared he could only keep synchronization active for a couple hours at a time. That said, he estimated he could use it 3 times per day, assuming they were adequately spaced apart. Taking everything into account, he calculated how many doses of the new elixir he could brew per day. He needed to figure that out before discussing specifics with Nesha. My yield with the regular elixirs has increased to 31% over the past year. The improvement was minuscule, though that was to be expected, as gains truly slowed down past 30%. Still, that meant his yield was a little under 68% for every one of the 3 steps. Each brewing session currently took him around 40 minutes. However, all those numbers would change drastically if he brewed the new elixirs from scratch, as the recipe involved 5 steps now. That meant his overall yield would drop to 14% and each batch would take over an hour. Percy quickly shook his head. No. That would be a waste of time. I'll ditch the first 3 steps. If he bought pre-brewed elixirs to use as his materials instead of nectar, he'd only have to go through the last 2 steps. A quick calculation revealed his yield would climb to over 45% that way, and he could cut the brewing time to under half an hour. Of course, it would cost him much more, but he guessed that would ultimately be negligible in the grand scheme of things, as the new steps would be the most profitable ones by far. That way, he could start with 400 drops of regular elixir and 4 cyan crystals every session, ending up with about 180 drops of the new product. And he could do that twice an hour. So, if I also take into account the time needed to actually condense the crystals, I can probably brew about 19 doses per day. That wasn't too bad. He currently needed 6 for himself, though that might go up to 9 depending on what Mickey's second affinity ended up being. The rest he could sell. Let's not sell all of it. I also need to build myself a stash for when I leave the guild. Making up his mind, Percy was about to head off to Freddy's, when somebody knocked on his door, startling him. Moment of truth, he thought, crossing his fingers. Rarely getting visitors, he knew it was either Nesha here to make a deal, or an official of the guild here because she ratted him out. Opening the door, he was relieved to see it was the former. In fact, she looked a little different to how she usually did, her expression being a touch brighter, an ambitious glint noticeable in her eyes. Percy couldn't help but smile, realizing she had taken the bait when a mischievous idea crossed his mind. Perhaps he should slam the door in her face to get back at her for earlier. Nah, let's not antagonize the eccentric girl now that she's finally on board. Still, it was difficult to keep the smugness out of his voice. Well, I take it you're interested all of a sudden? Nesha ignored him, rolling her eyes. She shoved him inside before letting herself into the house, closing the door behind her. Do you have any idea what this means? This was Percy's first time hearing actual excitement in her tone. Duh, why do you think I came to you? He asked back. Nesha let the response sink in for a couple of seconds, before walking over to Percy's kitchen and plopping down on a chair. She then crossed one leg over the other before speaking again. Who else knows about this? Percy shrugged. My alchemy mentor helped me perfect the recipe, but he's promised to stay quiet for the next 20 years. I can brew them by myself. Nesha nodded. You do realize what you're asking of me, right? It's not easy smuggling anything out of the guild, let alone something like this. You need to pull all sorts of strings to make this happen. And that's just to get them out of the settlement. Let's not even mention the difficulty involved in finding a rich, reliable customer. Percy grabbed another chair, setting it a couple meters in front of Nesha before joining her. Can you make it happen, or not? She grinned. I want 50%. But Percy failed to suppress a chuckle. Talk about a rip-off. I'm the one who has to spend all day in a lab. 30%. No way. It's really time-consuming on my end too. 40%. Percy shook his head. You can't do this without me, but I can do it without you. Need I remind you that I can tell when you lie? She smiled. Fine. I admit I don't have any other options available right now. Still, I can take my sweet time finding somebody else. Good luck reinventing the recipe by yourself. Percy didn't back down. Though Nesha was clearly just as stubborn. You won't find a better middleman than me. Even ignoring my bloodline, I have connections to the Asclepius house. Percy raised an eyebrow. The Asclepius house was one of the 7 great houses. Their prestige aside, one of their most important traits was they possessed a lot of people with the memory bank bloodline. It allowed them to freely manipulate or even erase their own memories. One of the house's most valuable assets was a specially trained order known as the Oblivious Agents. They could execute a sensitive task and then erase all memory of it afterwards, thus eliminating all trails leading back to the one who commissioned it. If Percy and Nesha went through them to contact their potential buyer, they would more easily keep themselves anonymous, cutting their losses in case they got betrayed. Not to mention that she could also use her own bloodline to ensure they didn't cheat her. Fine, 35% and we have a deal. Percy conceded. 35% is just my share, she emphasized. Keep in mind that hiring an Oblivious agent is going to cost us a lot too. Percy wasn't happy to hear that, but he knew she was telling the truth. How much do you think the elixirs can even sell for? Beats me. Nesha admitted. If I was free to auction them all over Remia, they could easily sell 100 times more than the regular ones. That much. Percy was shocked. He knew it was a big deal, but that was still more than his estimates. After all, they could only be used 3 times as often. These things don't scale linearly. It's a premium item. Do you have any idea how many people would fight over them? Imagine how much money somebody close to Violet would be willing to spend to save themselves a few centuries. Percy swallowed a lump of saliva as he pondered the implications. It was true. It wasn't easy to put a price tag on something that could save a noble house from the verge of extinction, or even elevate them to a great house. But you can't auction them freely, can you? He caught the caveat in her words. Naturally not, she said, exhaling in disappointment. If I did that, everyone who lost the auction would just publicize the elixirs to get back at us. Needless to say, everything would go to shit at that point. I need to investigate potential candidates and only approach those I think will pay the most. So how much do you think we can make? Percy asked again. She shrugged. It's hard to say before doing my due research. We can't push too far given the circumstances. Still, I guess it shouldn't be too difficult to sell them for over a dozen times as much as the regular elixirs. Percy nodded. That was a lot of money. Even after keeping most doses to himself and taking out Nesha's share and the rest of their expenses, it would still be enough to afford Mickey's potions after a few months. Very well, he said, extending his hand. But I'll need your help with a couple more things. How the hell did he manage this less than 3 years after joining the guild? Nesha couldn't help but wonder. Countless experienced alchemists had failed to improve the elixirs after tens of millennia, yet here Percy came, one lone redborn boy, revolutionizing the field in no time. Obviously, there was some secret behind his success, though Nesha knew better than to ask. It wasn't her job to snoop around Percy's business. She had her own end of the deal to worry about. Entering her house, she made her way to her bed before lying down. This is going to be such a pain, she sighed. While she hadn't lied to Percy, getting this to work was a lot more complicated than she had let on. It was true the great houses were scrutinized a lot less by the guild's officials, but the Oblivious agent would still have to regularly smuggle goods in and out of the settlement. Naturally, they'd have to bribe lots of guards to turn a blind eye, though that would only leave more trails leading back to her and Percy. The only solution would be for the agent to place the bribes himself, ensuring all knowledge pertaining to the operation would be forgotten. At least, they wouldn't be the first people hiring an agent inside the Alchemists' Guild. Lots of noble houses did that, to keep their dealings secret from one another. As long as Nesha was careful, nobody would link the appearance of the new elixirs to her movements, even if something went wrong down the line. But there's another problem. This was going to be a recurring transaction, not a one-time deal. Naturally, the request might raise a few eyebrows in the Asclepius house's management. Fortunately, the higher-ups also erased their memories after sending out their subordinates, but Nesha would still have to be cautious not to reveal anything too sensitive in her correspondence. After all, even a great house could crumble under the pressure of the divine order, should the secret eventually leak. And Percy isn't making things easy for me either, she grumbled. Before sealing the deal with her, he'd asked her to help him procure over 110,000 doses of enlightenment potion. Naturally, the request had truly left Nesha flabbergasted. She hadn't the slightest clue what that madman needed all those potions for, but getting them was no trivial thing. First, they didn't even know if the guild had so many in stock. Even if they did, they couldn't exactly explain how there was suddenly such a great demand for a previously dead product. But Percy had insisted, telling her this was one of the main reasons why he'd even wanted to sell the new elixirs in the first place. Begrudgingly, Nesha had agreed to help, though not before making it clear they'd have to do it very carefully. They couldn't buy all the potions at once, nor could they purchase them directly within the guild. I suppose we can have the oblivious agent handle that too. Over a period of about 6 months, the agent would slowly buy the potions a few at a time, transporting them outside the settlement. In fact, they could make that the agent's official reason for being there. The unusual request might raise a few eyebrows, but ultimately the guild's higher-ups would assume some noble house had found a purpose for the potion. Meanwhile, the agent would unofficially sneak them back into the settlement whenever he returned, delivering them to Percy. Obviously, going through these extra hoops would add to the cost, but it was a small price to pay to sleep at night. Besides, Nesha estimated the gains from the new elixirs would more than cover the expense. Now, let's see who we're going to sell them to. Grabbing a quill and a few pieces of parchment, Nesha started writing down the names of all the noble houses she knew of. It took quite a lot of head-scratching, as it had been years since she'd last dealt with people outside the Alchemists' Guild. Still, she'd studied Remius geography, politics and economics extensively in her youth, so a lot of it had stuck. Only about 700, she frowned. She couldn't remember all the noble houses, nor was she up to date with recent developments. Some of the ones she'd written down might have been destroyed by now. I'm sure the bigger ones are still around, she shrugged. The oldest houses were also the richer ones, and the ones most likely to have survived. Their client would probably come from those. Plus, she could cross-check the house's details to make sure everything was in order before following through. Happy with the list, she started adding a few details next to each name, whatever she remembered about their leaders. After all, the Violet Corps in charge would be the ones buying the elixirs. Once she was done, she began crossing out some of them. The ones with younger leaders were definitely out. A recently promoted Violet Corps still thousands of years from reaching white wouldn't be desperate enough to buy the elixirs at a premium. The same was true for the poorest houses who lacked the funds. Upon narrowing the list to just under 100 candidates, she started paying attention to more details. The son of House Pallas's leader is on the cusp of reaching Violet. Not her. She's known to be really stingy. Oh. Houses Antaeus and Talos have been in a conflict for centuries. I'm sure one of them might be interested in gaining an edge over their rival. That guy is still far from white, but he's known to splurge. Nesha didn't even notice when the sun rose. She couldn't recall the last time she'd been immersed in her work enough to pull an all-nighter. Ever since her house's downfall, she hadn't been that motivated to do much. At some point, she put down the quill, though it wasn't because she'd grown tired. Nesha had just run out of ink. Oh well. I suppose I've narrowed them down enough for now. There were only 10 houses left on the parchment. Nesha was certain all of them would be interested in the elixirs. The only question was how much each of them would be willing to spend. In any case, she figured it was best not to delve any further before getting some recent information on them. She'd ask around to bring herself up to speed over the next couple of days before finalizing her choice. Leaving her house, Nesha walked to one of the official shops to buy some ink before returning. Her next order of business would be to write the letter to House Asclepius, requesting the services of the oblivious agent. Not going to enjoy this part, she wrinkled her nose in disgust. There was a reason why Nesha felt confident she could contact the Great House. It was because House Veritas used to have strong ties to them. In fact, Nesha's ancestors were rumored to have derived their own truth-seeker bloodline from a branch of the Great House. After all, House Asclepius was one of the wealthiest even among the great houses, specializing in commerce and information trading. They had multiple related bloodlines to aid them in those ventures. The memory bank bloodline the oblivious agents possessed was only one of them. Nesha had no idea why the great house hadn't lifted a finger when her family got butchered and, frankly, she didn't much care about House Asclepius's internal politics either. That said, the thought of doing business with them again made her stomach churn. I guess I'll have to make some sacrifices if I ever want to take revenge on those bastards. So far, she'd taken things slow, well, at least according to her. From an outsider's perspective, establishing such a popular gambling den within 3 years of joining the guild was rather impressive. Still, Nesha knew she could have done much more in that time had she put her mind to it. However, she hadn't been too motivated to rush things, as she hadn't expected it would be easy to get back at her enemies with money alone. But things were different now. This new opportunity Percy had given her could change everything. Not only would it be far more profitable than her gambling den, it could also help her grow her personal strength. Before, Nesha had completely ignored her own magic, assuming she wouldn't get very far as an Orangeborn. Now, even reaching Violet wasn't out of the question. Let's do it then, she decided, her eyes glinting with resolve. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Knock, knock. The door opened a few seconds later, Percy soon greeting her. He was drenched in sweat, his eyes looking tired. Did he also pull an all-nighter, or is brewing actually so taxing? She raised an eyebrow. What's up? Do we have news already? He asked after she remained silent for too long. Hearing him, Nesha scowled. It hasn't even been a day since we made the deal. I haven't sent the letters yet, nor have I settled on a candidate. Percy shrugged. All right, no need to get angry. What do you want then? Nesha took a deep breath to calm down before speaking. Well, I was thinking. We can't keep calling these the new elixirs. Coming up with a catchy name is half the battle. Percy's jaw slackened upon hearing her. What are you looking at me like that for? She asked in irritation. Are you the same Nesha who patches her signs up? Since when do you care about optics? Or marketability? Nesha felt some heat gather in her cheeks. Look! What I've done in the guild so far hasn't been a huge deal. It would have succeeded regardless. But this is a high-profile business we're trying to build here. Every little bit helps if you want some extra money from our clients. Percy smiled. Well, you're the one in charge of the sales. Any good suggestions? He asked. Nesha nodded. Aurora Dew. It had been 2 weeks since Percy and Nesha settled on the name of their product, and progress had been steady. Nesha had already reached out to the Asclepius house and hired the agent. She'd also narrowed down the potential customers to 3, having promised to finalize her decision and send the letters by tomorrow at the latest. Meanwhile, Percy had focused on brewing. Granted, he'd initially lacked the contribution points to purchase the sheer volume of materials necessary, over 40 doses of the regular elixirs per day. Luckily, Nesha had chipped in, buying him the ingredients through the agent. They both knew they'd make everything back a dozen times over once the sales kicked off anyway. But none of that was on his mind today. Estimating he'd prepared enough Aurora Dew to start their upcoming venture, Percy was free to take another day off alchemy. He wanted to practice his magic some more while he still had time to spare. So, he found himself standing atop a softly glowing mushroom once again, the fantastical landscape around him humming with latent energy. Shimmering motes fell lazily from the fungal fronds above, painting his surroundings in all sorts of colors. And another unfortunate wasp grazed carelessly a few paces ahead, the loud buzz of its wings betraying its location no less than its oversized visage did. First, let's see how far I can push my spells now. Percy took a deep breath, the cool, earthy scent of the spire mixing with the sharper tang of magic in the air. He activated circulation with both cores, feeling the familiar rush of mana flooding his channels with power. But he didn't stop there. Having grown a little more accustomed to synchronization since first discovering it, he could now activate it a bit more quickly. Though keeping it up for long was still difficult. The moment the technique took effect, he gathered both types of mana in his hands, manifesting his tools. A layer of pure mana formed a pair of gloves. At the same time, the soul mana coalesced into the shape of silver sickles, the ethereal glint of their curved blades resembling crescent moons. Meanwhile, the bug darted erratically in the distance, only now spotting Percy, the undeniable pressure he exerted finally revealing his presence. "I guess you drew the short end of the stick today, pal." Tightening his grip on the weapons, he launched forward with no warning, as his boot sank slightly into the spongy surface of the mushroom. He closed the distance in a couple powerful strides, his heart racing in tandem with the steady beat of his magic. The bug barely dodged the vicious slashes, and only because Percy allowed it to. Naturally, he had no intention of eliminating his training dummy so soon into the fight. Still, the creature was instantly on the back foot, unable to do much besides clumsily evading his attacks. Man and insect danced, the former swapping out his spells every few minutes to test them all, as the latter constantly hovered all over the place, struggling to match his footwork. Over the next few minutes, Percy tried the alternative variants of the parting gift, the silver daggers, as well as some throwing stars with 3 curved blades apiece. He developed those in the months before he quit hunting. Later, he even brought the quarterstaff back from retirement to see how much sturdier it had grown. Finally, he manifested the cyan sheet he'd used to shield himself from the acidic rain, though his status had never deigned to register it. Okay, the results are as expected. Obviously, his pure magic had benefited the most from his advancement. Not that the spells were particularly potent, the flimsy constructs falling apart rather easily upon colliding against the creature's exoskeleton. It was to be expected, really, due to their lower grade and lacking affinity. That said, they'd grown at least marginally usable again. As for his parting gift, it had already been lethal enough before Percy's promotion, and it had grown more powerful still, mostly thanks to synchronization. Satisfied with his improvements, Percy was ready to move on to the next phase. With a quick flick of his sickle, he casually dispatched the soldier, the bug's luck having finally run out. The man-sized creature might have given him a tough fight a couple years ago, but that time had long passed. With its soul cleanly bisected, the wasp's carapace collapsed lifelessly upon the giant mushroom. Core! In typical Mickey fashion, the crow eagerly leapt on the carcass, activating circulation to more easily dig the core out of the bug's sternum. Not paying his familiar any heed, Percy then concentrated on his mana, gathering both types between his palms. How am I meant to combine them? Every affinity had its own properties, meaning each pair was unique and had to be fused in a different manner. While Gabe had run into his share of difficulties, he also had an advantage over Percy. He possessed 2 elemental affinities. Their fusion was a composite one, light, which existed in nature, making it inherently stable. Meanwhile, Percy had it easier in other ways, as he controlled both of his cores, and they were currently at the same grade. However, he was also disadvantaged in that his affinities could not achieve a stable fusion. The good news was they could still merge, according to the book he and Gabe had read. Unfortunately, fusing 2 otherwise incompatible affinities was trickier. It required the user to actively exert their will upon the mana even more forcefully, essentially commanding it to behave contrary to its nature. Sadly, there were too many possible combinations, and while the documents they'd found had listed a few examples, a pairing between pure mana and soul mana hadn't been one of them. But it can be done. The only question is how. In Gabe's case, it had been straightforward as his affinities both had physical properties, interacting with one another. Air fueled the flames, causing them to burn more intensely. From there, Percy and Gabe had only needed to take the reaction to its extreme, ultimately consuming the 2 substances, converting them to light. Yet in Percy's case, that wasn't an option. His soul mana was incorporeal, and simply phased through the pure mana. The 2 energies occupied the same space without interacting. One is tangible, while the other isn't. I suppose this is what the book meant when it said, "I need to make them behave contrary to their nature." Focusing on that clue, Percy allowed most of the mana between his palms to dissipate, the overlapping blobs now shrinking to the size of a strawberry. Perhaps he'd been too greedy trying to fuse more than that on his first attempt. Next, he concentrated on a single thought, giving the soul mana a physical form. He pictured the silver orb as something he could grab, trying to squeeze it between his hands. Percy had held his soul constructs before, of course, but he'd done so with his soul, not his flesh. Next, he imagined the cyan mana touching it and pushing against it. Nothing. After going through all sorts of mental exercises over the next hour, he failed to induce any noticeable change. Maybe I have it backwards? Without much to lose, Percy spent some more time attempting the opposite, robbing the cyan mana of its substance, hoping it would interact with his soul. But he failed once more. Well, duh. I obviously can't make the pure mana incorporeal. That's a unique property of soul mana. If it was possible to do this, 20% of the people on Remia would essentially be walking around with a soul affinity. He had to force the mana to behave contrary to its nature, but he couldn't just ignore its nature entirely. And the nature of soul mana, no, the nature of souls, was to occupy living bodies, controlling them. Percy's eyes widened in realization. That's it. I need to make my soul mana possess my pure mana. Confident he was onto something, he overlapped the spheres again. Next, he willed them into cubes, then pyramids, cones, cylinders and other shapes. He observed them with both regular sight and soul vision, paying attention to his timing. At first, it was a little off, as he'd never done anything like this before. Sometimes the pure mana would transform sooner, while other times the soul mana would. But he gradually improved, the transition slowly beginning to sync up more and more. Percy intentionally allowed himself to fall into a trance, trying to trick his mind into thinking of the two objects as one in the same, components of a greater whole. He imagined the silver shape as nothing more than the soul of the cyan one, hiding within its vessel, obligated to follow its every movement. At first, this seemed like another exercise in futility. Yet Percy wasn't in a rush to give up. He had a hunch it was worth trying for a while longer. He could swear he felt some faint feedback from the two objects every now and then. It was as if the silver mana latched onto the cyan shape at times, requiring less prodding from Percy to copy its transitions. Core? Percy vaguely heard his familiar call out to him. It was only then he realized he'd deactivated synchronization entirely at some point, having grown too tired to keep it up. He wasn't sure how long he'd been at it, but the sun was close to setting. Just a few more minutes, he thought, diving into the exercise again. More time passed, as Percy continued to play with the two types of mana between his palms, his attention glued to the twin shapes. Core! Core! Hearing the crow's cries, the young man noticed it was dark already. Probably late at night too, in fact. Remembering the settlement was a few hours away on foot, Percy decided to finally call it a day. It sucked to return empty-handed, but perhaps this wasn't the sort of thing he could master after a single session. All right, buddy. Let's go, he replied, allowing the mana to dissipate. However, something unexpected happened. Right as the two spheres shattered into motes of silver and cyan, they revealed a third, smaller shape resting inside. It was only about the size of a pea, but it looked like it was made of an entirely different material than the others. Don't tell me. Unable to contain his excitement, Percy carefully pinched the substance between his thumb and index finger, noticing it was corporeal. It felt exactly like his pure mana to the touch, though its color was different, an amalgamation of its components. A pale shade of teal. As much as he would have liked to stay and practice some more, Percy knew he'd have to resume brewing tomorrow. He couldn't afford to pull an all-nighter on the spire. Have I signed my freedom away? He groaned. Granted, adhering to a tight schedule wasn't exactly new to him. He'd done that for years already. That said, it was one thing working non-stop for himself, out of discipline, and another thing entirely to be held accountable to a third party like Nesha or their customers. I guess I'm still doing it for myself, he sighed. I really need that money. In any case, he could at least take his sweet time on the way back to the guild, playing around with the minuscule quantity of teal fog he'd managed to create. It wasn't enough to form a proper spell, but perhaps he could discern some of its properties. Splitting the exotic substance in half, to avoid wasting all of it by accident, he pinched a portion with his other hand. Next, he willed it to solidify, forming a marble smaller than his fingernail. It worked, allowing Percy to curiously fiddle with a tiny sphere for a few minutes, before ultimately crushing it between his fingers. Many of the fragments dissipated on the spot, though he did manage to salvage a few. He melted them again before merging them back to the rest of the material in his other hand. It behaves much like my pure mana. Except when it breaks. Percy drew a trickle from his second core, manifesting a cyan orb about the same size as before. Then he handled it in a similar manner for a while, comparing the two objects in his mind. Once he was satisfied with his observations, he shattered it too, noting the teal sphere hadn't been any more durable than the cyan one. Percy had exerted about the same amount of force to crush both. Other than the color, the only difference was the pure mana dissipated completely into motes, making it a little harder to retrieve. Is that the only benefit? Recycling it more easily? If that was the case, Percy would be disappointed. Gabe's light spell had been both hotter and quicker than either of its components. Though that had come at the cost of its mass, it would still be the superior option in many circumstances. Meanwhile, the only advantage to the teal fog so far was that Percy might be able to chain his magic, reshaping one spell into another smoothly. It wasn't nothing, but he'd certainly expected more. That can't be everything, he shook his head. It has yet to display any properties of soul mana. Glancing back at the substance in his palm, he focused on its ethereal nature this time. He flashed out all thoughts related to his pure mana from his mind, visualizing only his original affinity. Hopefully, that might draw out any latent effects the teal fog had yet to reveal. Taking it a step further, he shaped it into a miniature parting gift. There wasn't that much of the fused mana, but he still managed to form a tiny sickle in the end, though it looked more like a strange earring. Still, his self-induced illusion seemed to have yielded some results. It feels different, he raised an eyebrow. The small weapon looked the same, but its tiny handle had partially sunk into his skin. Percy could tell from experience he was pinching it with his soul now, not his flesh. His eyes widened. Holy shit! I can choose whether to make it tangible or not. Percy walked onto another suspension bridge absent-mindedly, retracing the way home by instinct. Next, he played around with the teal construct some more, trying to change it between the two states at will. Getting himself into the correct frame of mind took some effort, but he did get the sickle to transition between corporeal and incorporeal a few more times. Yet, there was more. Did it turn invisible just now? Percy raised an eyebrow. He'd only stumbled upon this by accident, having not even tried to rob the construct of its color. In fact, he'd almost forgotten his soul mana was invisible by default. After all, he rarely used it without activating circulation first, which came with passive soul vision. Not just that, but his constructs were much denser than they used to be, making them faintly visible to the naked eye. Still, can I pick out what properties to give it? That could really enrich my kit. Currently, his options were essentially set in stone. Half his mana was invisible and intangible, while the rest was both opaque and corporeal, albeit flimsy. But what if he could control his entire mana pool, freely assigning his constructs whatever effect was convenient at any given time? Eager to confirm if that was possible, Percy resumed his experimentation, playing around with the teal fog some more. And sure enough, it has for possible states. Even the ones I can't access normally. Percy could definitely think of a situation where he might need a construct that was corporeal yet invisible. For example, if he wanted to trick an enemy immune to soul damage. Or to shield his face from a physical attack without inhibiting his own vision in the process. Likewise, the opposite could be handy, a spell that was opaque yet able to phase through objects. Perhaps he could conjure illusions with it, or pass a message through a wall. The possibilities were endless. Though it's going to have a high skill ceiling. It had taken him all day to fuse the tiniest amount of teal fog. Changing its properties wasn't exactly easy either. And Percy also doubted recycling the mana from one spell to the next would be trivial. Each of these steps would take a lot of practice to learn. Still, I'll be able to pull off all sorts of tricks once I master it. Percy nodded in appreciation once he fully understood the path which lay before him. His fused mana might not be stronger than its two components in the traditional sense, but it did open some interesting doors for him. If he had to use one word to summarize it, it would be versatile. Oh, I guess I'm back. Without realizing, Percy had reached the settlement. Today had definitely been productive, as he'd not only familiarized himself with the rest of his magic post-advancement, but also taken another step along the prestigious path the Moirai had paved. By all means, he should be happy. Yet, grumble. Percy grimaced. How am I going to sleep without my fix? Since his first day in the Alchemist's Guild, he'd never gone once without a honey roll. Sadly, he'd returned way too late tonight. Freddy should have long closed already. I hope I have something edible at home. Walking along the empty streets of the settlement, Percy tried his best to keep his mind on the colorful particles dancing in the wind, ignoring his protesting stomach. Eventually, he arrived at his house, pressing his badge against the door to open it. As a newcomer, he used to appreciate the mysterious runes making conveniences like this possible. That said, his recent trip to the Vault of Magic had truly put Remius' relatively primitive technology into perspective. Entering, he paused, noticing a sealed envelope by his feet. Percy wasn't very surprised, having expected Elaine's reply. The two had kept in touch since her first mail a few months back. Picking the letter up in a hurry, he dropped it on his nightstand for later, before rushing to the preservation box. Desperately digging through the container for scraps, he soon realized there wasn't much there, just some stale bread and a few vegetables of questionable quality. At least I won't starve. Making a mental note to restock at some point, he then begrudgingly stuffed his face with as much food as he could tolerate. Next, he took off his robes. He tossed the immaculate fabric a passing glance, appreciating how his clothes had remained spotless after another hunting trip. Then, he dove into the shower, eager to finish his chores as quickly as possible. Soon, he found himself resting on his bed. There was only one last item left for today. Extending his arm, he grabbed the envelope from the table. Technically, he didn't have to read the message right now, he could leave it for tomorrow. But Percy would rather get it over with, having grown a little worried over the recent developments back at home. Ripping the envelope, he took the letter out, before unfolding the light indigo paper, his attention falling on his cousin's words. Dear Percy. Dear Percy. Forgive me if this is not the exact day, as I'm not sure when the letter will find you, but Happy 20. Percy paused for a moment, calculating the date. With everything going on, he'd honestly forgotten about his birthday, which had actually been a couple days ago. Close enough, he shrugged, returning to the message. I wanted to bake you a cake, though I wasn't sure it would survive the trip. I suppose we'll have to add it to those I owe you. What is it, 3 now? I can't believe you've been gone for so long already. Grumble. A cake would be lovely right about now, he thought, grabbing his aching stomach. His arguably spoiled dinner hadn't done much to fill him up, but that didn't stop it from stirring a storm in there, preparing for its prison break. In any case, I hope you remember to take a day off to celebrate. Being so hardworking is definitely one of your better traits, but everyone needs some downtime once in a while. Percy chuckled. Even after all those years, his cousin knew him so well. I did take a break today though. Well, sort of. Training on the spire wasn't exactly relaxing, but it was fun. He fully intended to negotiate with Nesher about properly weaving it into his timetable, at least once or twice a month. As nice as it was to make money, his new trick wouldn't master itself. In other news, my mom gave birth a few weeks ago. I have a baby brother now. We're calling him O'Wine. He's really cute too, I can't wait for you to meet him. He doesn't have our blue hair, so we think he might not have Dad's water affinity, but the jury is still out on Earth. As for the bloodline, I suppose we won't be sure until he's 5, but it doesn't tend to resurface after skipping a generation either. Reading Elaine's words, Percy couldn't help but revisit what he'd recently learned about decrees. It was technically possible for children on Remia to awaken their cores before taking the affinity test, though it was exceedingly rare. The very contact with Phoebe's mana seemed to not only give them access to their status, but also catalyze their cores, or something, allowing them to discover them and begin filling them up. What did people do before Phoebe became a Titan? Did kids have to get older to tap into their magic? Either way, Percy sure hoped his new cousin wouldn't be a Redborn like him. Granted, the odds weren't on the baby's side, though his life would certainly be a lot easier if he got lucky. Yawn. Okay, maybe this isn't the time to contemplate life's great questions. Let's just read the rest and go to sleep. I'd honestly prefer to end the letter here, as I don't want to sour your birthday with bad news. However, it's probably best that you're aware of what's going on around here. Sensing the shift in tone, Percy couldn't help but perk up a little. Long story short, House Tantalus has grown even more aggressive. Their goons have begun crossing River Glyne and attacking members of our house. They've already killed 2 people, kidnapped 3 more, and injured about a dozen, to various extents. Most of them I don't think you knew very well, but Hector is dead. Percy's eyes widened. His relationship to that cousin of his had never been great, the older boy having mocked and bullied him his whole life. Still, Percy had never wished him such a grim fate. These bastards are really pushing it, he gritted his teeth. In normal times, House Tantalus wouldn't have gone so far. Though they'd gained the upper hand since their raid a few decades ago, the 2 families' strength wasn't that far apart. Typically, they would have laid low, dealing a blow whenever a good opportunity presented itself, yet without escalating the conflict too fast, risking an all-out war. After all, such a development wouldn't benefit either party. It's probably because of the petals. They want to chip away at our house so they can more easily pressure us when the time comes. Part of Percy wanted to return and help. While he didn't get along with all his relatives, there were people back home he did care about. However, he also knew he couldn't do much as he was. He might have grown enough to hold his own against anyone at Yellow, but a noble house of that size had scores upon scores of people at Green. In any case, you don't need to worry about us. Their blue cores are too valuable to be sent out on such low-level skirmishes, and I'm not afraid of anyone below that. Also, Grandpa isn't one to take this lying down either. So far, he's remained passive to avoid throwing more oil in the fire, but enough's enough. The other day, I overheard him talking about retaliating. So yeah? We'll be fine. Just please, don't try returning home on your own. Wait for the envoys if you really want to come. Other than that, we can't wait to have you back. Happy birthday again. Elaine. It was probably true. She should be able to handle herself against any of their juniors, thanks to circulation. Even those with the bloodline. But only if it's a one-on-one. They couldn't count on those scumbags to play fair, so he certainly hoped Baldy was keeping an eye on his granddaughter. Folding the letter, he placed it in a drawer with the rest. Percy wasn't the most sentimental guy, but he'd kept all of their correspondence. He didn't really have many other possessions anyway, other than his alchemy equipment. Then, he let his head sink back into the pillow. His current plan was to spend another couple of years in the guild, raising his and Mickey's strength some more. He'd only leave a few months before the lotus bloomed, to compete for a petal. I need to start preparing though. I guess I should try that soon. ******. A couple more weeks went by without any hiccups. Luckily Nesha had managed to strike promising deals with 2 customers in that time, the contribution points having started flowing in already. The first was Aeneas, the current leader of House Priam. He was actually one of the oldest violet cores on all of Remia, widely considered to have the best chance of reaching white. Should he succeed, he'd elevate his family to the 8th great house. Adding to that, House Priam was fortunate in other ways. Located in a fertile yet remote region, they were free to develop without many enemies. Suffice to say, Aeneas was rich and had nothing better to spend his money on. 11,000 points per dose is still crazy. That's nearly 30 times the cost of the normal elixirs. Percy was shocked when Nesha told him. Sadly, their second customer wasn't quite so lucrative. The leader of House Talos was a relatively young violet core, thousands of years from White. His family was constantly at war against their neighbors, House Antaeus. Naturally, they didn't have too many resources to spare. That said, it also made them desperate to spend what little they did have to grasp any edge they could get their hands on. Ultimately, Nesha had chosen them over their rivals because they had a blue core closer to violet. That person would probably end up as the recipient of the Aurora Dew. In the end, House Talos had agreed to purchase the new elixir at 8,000 points apiece, which, although much less than what House Priam was paying, was still a hefty sum. Percy would have been happy to leave it at that. He personally only needed 6 doses per day and, after selling just as many to their customers, he could save the rest for the future. However, Nesha had made him an unexpected offer. The girl had wanted to purchase another set of Aurora Dew, this one for her own use. Specifically, she'd pay 8,000 points per dose, matching what they made from House Talos. According to her, they wouldn't make more if they approached a third customer anyway, and her share of the profits was more than enough to cover the expense. Naturally, Percy hadn't had any reason to decline, though his partner's offer had surprised him. Nesha had never struck him as the type who cared much about her own magic, a pity too, as he thought she was wasting her rare and powerful space affinity. Evidently, she intended to change that. And that was on top of all the other things she had to do. Namely, managing their deals and even keeping the gambling den open, to avoid drawing suspicion. In a strange turn of events, the lazy girl had turned a lot more hardworking. What's her goal anyway? He couldn't help but wonder. But he shook his head. That wasn't any of his business. He should respect her privacy as she had respected his. In any case, Percy was currently standing at the ground level of the Fungal Spire. He had plenty of training plans for today, though those were for later. Right now, he was waiting for somebody. He was about to meet the oblivious agent for the first time. Generally, Percy didn't have to interact with the agent much. His primary responsibility was to brew the elixirs. As for everything else, it was taken care of by Nesha. However, there was one task Percy couldn't delegate to anyone else. I hope this is the right spot. Today, he wore a full-body shroud to conceal his face and the color of his robes. To further disguise himself, Percy stuffed a pillow under his shirt and crouched slightly, making him appear shorter and bulkier than usual. Maybe it was a bit overkill, but he preferred being overly cautious than careless. Of course, the agent might still discern his grade via mana sense. That's why he'd asked Nesha to procure him another enchanted bandage, wrapping it around his chest. You didn't need to go to all this trouble. I won't remember anything about you or this meeting 5 minutes from now, a man spoke. The newcomer faintly appeared on the horizon, casually walking towards Percy. He seemed to be wearing a dark cowl, though it was hard to tell from the distance. The air shimmered with colorful motes, obscuring his figure further. Percy guessed the man must have used a spell to project his voice from so far away. It had sounded distorted, yet oddly clear, likely due to a sound affinity. I'd rather not take any chances. Percy replied, deepening his own voice too. Nesha's arrangements had admittedly grown quite complex, yet thorough. She was clearly just as paranoid as him, if not more. The agent had to juggle half a dozen tasks, plus she had him erase any memories the moment they ceased being necessary. She also met him regularly, to update him on any information he required for his next moves. Finally, she took every chance she could to use her bloodline on him, confirming he had no intention of going off script or betraying them. Fair enough, the man said once he drew closer. He placed a heavy-looking pouch on the ground about a dozen meters from Percy, its contents making all sorts of crisp sounds as they tumbled over one another. A cursory glance via mana sense revealed the agent's core was concealed too, which admittedly made Percy feel a little uneasy. For all he knew, the guy could be at blue, more than capable of casually killing him with nobody ever finding out. Calm down, Percy. As long as they don't know the recipe, you're more valuable alive anyway. Why do you guys even do this? He asked out loud, partly to conceal his inner turmoil and partly out of genuine curiosity. It's no big deal. We have a unique talent, so we're using it in service of our family, the agent replied. Well, sure, but isn't the cost too high? Aren't you worried you'll look back one day only to realize you can't remember half your life? The man shrugged. You're overestimating the importance of these memories. Contemplating the agent's words, Percy felt they made sense. If anything, the man was probably better off forgetting every time he assassinated a target or spent weeks trekking through a forest. It was more of a blessing than a curse, really. Unaware of Percy's thoughts, the agent then left, having completed this part of his mission. Only when he was gone did Percy dare approach the pouch, opening it. It was large enough to fit 2 watermelons inside, filled to the brim with small vials about the size of his pinky. Each contained a deep crimson liquid that looked a bit like glowing blood. And there were thousands upon thousands of them in there. Naturally, these were the Enlightenment potions, or at least the first batch. Percy had asked to be paid in this manner for the near future. Mickey! Come over here! The crow was busy hunting starry workers on the mushrooms above. Percy hadn't called it over sooner, as he hadn't wanted to risk the agent spotting it. While waiting for his familiar to arrive, he took off his disguise. Folding everything, he stashed it on a nearby tree, hiding it carefully in the vibrant canopy. Truth be told, the meeting with the agent had largely assuaged his worry. The man didn't seem like he had any intention of hurting him. Still, there wasn't any harm in dressing up next time too. Caw! Mickey greeted him a few minutes later. The bird hastily grabbed the pouch in its beak before flying away. It was heavy, straining the crow's flight somewhat, though Percy figured it would manage to carry it to its nest. Eventually. They'd already confirmed the potions worked as intended, so the only thing left was for Mickey to consume them. Of course, it would take him hours to drink so many, but that was a small price to pay. Seeing his familiar leave, Percy headed off too. It was still early, and he had other plans for today. Ascending to the second level of the spire, he walked about a quarter around it, reaching a region by the west side which he knew was already plenty far from prying eyes. Next, he spent a few minutes searching for the nearest starry worker. After finding one, he sat cross-legged on the fungus, some distance away from the bug. Then, he took a deep breath. Soon, a series of silver lines lit up underneath his skin, drawing a maelstrom around his sternum. Of course, Percy didn't bother activating circulation with his second core, as he didn't need the pure mana for what he wanted to do. As for synchronization, it would certainly help, but he couldn't keep it active for long enough yet. Once the technique began empowering him and replenishing his reserves, he sent out a pulse of mana from his sternum, rippling through his soul. He directed the waves to converge a few inches below his chest, before swiftly grabbing the resulting bump in a familiar manner. That's right. Percy had been ready to create another clone for a while, and he intended to do so right now, on the hunting grounds. Naturally, there were a bunch of reasons why he'd chosen this open location over the safety of his house, the first of which having to do with the very body he intended to possess. By the time Percy was done cultivating the bulge and filling it up with soul mana, several hours had passed. Mickey had already finished drinking the potions, and he'd returned to the second level too, to help Percy with the next step. Pinning the wasp down wasn't very difficult for the crow, though it did take some extra care to avoid killing it or injuring it too badly just yet. Grabbing the bug's thorax from behind, he clenched it tightly within his talons. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzz. It struggled desperately, of course, trying to escape the crow's clutches. However, it never stood a chance, as Mickey didn't have much trouble overpowering it, especially with the amber lines currently decorating his plumage, reinforcing his already superior strength. A couple minutes later, the bird dragged the starry worker to Percy, who was holding a silver orb thrumming with power in one hand, forming an ethereal dagger with the other. Glancing at the wasp before him, Percy considered how to best approach this. Given the potency of his soul constructs, even the slightest injury he inflicted would likely prove lethal. That much was fine, part of the plan even, as the creature wasn't going to survive either way. However, it did matter how soon the bug died. In the end, he went with a relatively shallow cut at its sternum, right around the center of its soul. The wasp let out a terrible, shrill sound. While Percy was ashamed to admit he didn't particularly care about the bug, he still couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt hearing its pained cry. A moment later, the creature stopped squirming, making him fear it was already dead. However, a cursory glance at its soul soon revealed that, although not in a great condition, it held on for now. "Please last a couple more hours," Percy pleaded, before falling on his back. With his torso and, by extension, the nascent clone in his grasp facing towards the sky, he finally willed his bloodline ability to activate. The ghostly claw awakened in his core once more. It leapt into the glowing orb with glee, twisting and severing it from Percy's soul. And as Percy clenched his teeth in pain, the silver meteor shot towards the stars above, soon disappearing from his sight. Now for the hard part. Percy had several goals for this particular clone. Though exploring the cosmos was arguably the most important tool in his arsenal, and by a huge margin, he decided to take a short break from that to test other potential uses for his ability. Naturally, the first thing he wanted to know was whether he could create local clones on Remia. He could imagine several scenarios where that would be handy, whether it was because he found an interesting body worth possessing, or because he needed another assistant to aid him back home. But there was more. If his only goal had been to possess that starry worker, he wouldn't have aimed his torso towards the sky. Instead, he could have launched his soul fragment directly at the creature, much like he'd done to the egg when creating his familiar. However, he hadn't done that. That was because Percy wanted to check one more thing. Can I return to Remia like this? He wondered, scanning the sea of souls surrounding him. His reasoning was simple. He might not always have access to the body he wanted to take over. It would serve him well if he could learn to navigate in this state better, developing a way to accurately reach a more distant target. I can't tell up from down like this though. While outside a body, Percy had a very distorted sense of time and space. Two seemingly nearby souls might not even be located on the same world as one another. But he did have something he could use as a makeshift compass. What happens if I focus on my main body? In all his previous expeditions, Percy had gazed outwards, searching for a suitable host while ignoring the ethereal cord linking him to the rest of his soul. Yet, the connection was always there, constantly trying to draw him back. Its pull kept growing stronger and stronger, until it became irresistible. So far, he'd only ever treated this phenomenon as a nuisance at worst, or a timer at best, indicating how long he had to complete his mission. Not today though. This time, he was going to approach his main body on purpose. Let's do this slowly. I don't want it to suck me in completely. Percy only allowed himself the most fleeting of glances. And it was a good thing he'd held back too. The moment his attention even brushed by his own soul, it attracted him far more forcefully than any foreign entity ever had. Percy felt the familiar glow enlarge in his mind rapidly, as he did everything in his power to halt his movement. He desperately fought against the connection, willing with all his strength to accelerate the exact opposite way. So lost was he in that frame of mind, in fact, that he didn't even register he had succeeded, until much later. By the time he regained awareness, he noted he wasn't moving, though the cord was even tenser than before. Is it because I approached my body, or because more time has passed? Either way, he couldn't afford to waste another second. Glancing at his own soul was no longer an option. He was far closer than before. If he did that again, he'd be absorbed for sure. Instead, he tried something else. Drawing some of his stashed mana, he pushed it into the ethereal cord. It flowed through it without any resistance, leaving his control. Nothing happened for a while. Yet, when Percy was starting to think he'd failed, a trickle of soul mana poured into him. It's more than a trickle, it's too much. His main body had already saturated the clone before cutting it off, so it couldn't fit much more. It only took him a moment to replenish the minuscule quantity he'd sent away, as well as any other traces he'd lost over time. The rest, he had to release outside, in the empty expanse between worlds, wasting it. But that wasn't important. The only thing that mattered was what this meant. Success! I'm in range of my main body. Percy would have grinned if he could. While the ethereal cord allowed him to communicate and even transfer mana over vast distances, it wasn't without limit. He'd only ever managed to use it like that with Mickey, who had never been more than a few miles away from him. As for his clones, Percy had never successfully sent them any mana before. The moment they left his body, they had always been on their own. Consequently, he couldn't even tell what the maximum range was. For all he knew, it might only stretch as far as the distance between his house in the settlement and Mickey's hunting spot on the second level of the spire. Or it might cover all of Remia and then some. Now what? Percy was a bit stuck. He couldn't get any closer, nor did he dare to send a message. He was afraid attempting to communicate with his main body was more likely to draw him in, which was why he'd opted to send mana instead. He couldn't move away either, as it still took a lot of effort to maintain his current distance. Thinking of something, he focused outwards once more, as the sea of souls manifested in his periphery. He could try approaching a different host to escape from his main body's pull. Of course, he wouldn't actually do that. After all, that would only waste his previous efforts. He had a better idea. As his mind brushed over the souls, he searched for one in particular. He knew it had to be close. There. He found it. It was the only healthy soul besides his own that didn't reject him. If anything, this one also exerted a pull on him, though it was much weaker than his main body's. Naturally, it was Mickey. There was no cord connecting him to the familiar, as all his wisps were linked to his main body, not each other. Still, he felt it was possible to possess the crow if he wanted. The wasp must be somewhere between the two. He didn't dare to look at them directly, to avoid being pulled, but he could tell their general direction. That said, locating the starry worker wasn't exactly trivial. In the material world, his main body and his familiar were standing next to each other, with the insect right alongside them. However, this wasn't the material world. A straight line there wasn't quite as straight in the world of souls. Still, there has to be some correlation. Percy sensed hundreds of souls where he expected the bug to be. He'd have to go through them, one by one. Most of them he could easily ignore, as they were too healthy. It helped to know his target was on the verge of death. Of course, it wouldn't be the only one that met the criterion. This was the Fungal Spire, where lots of people spent all day hunting bugs. The rest should be above orange, he remembered. Other people hunted in the upper levels. While Percy had struggled to tell the souls' grades apart back when he began using his bloodline, he'd improved a lot since then. Having sent out dozens of clones already, he was confident he could tell the starry worker apart from its stronger cousins. And sure enough, there! The soul was fading, on the verge of fizzling out. Since he'd taken care not to injure the bug too badly, it could only mean he'd spent too long looking for it. Let's hope it's still functional. Without missing a beat, he concentrated on his suspected target, accelerating towards it. The very next moment, he found himself in a familiar situation, stuck inside a foreign vessel. Though this one wasn't as crammed as usual. Much of his host's soul had already evaporated, leaving him ample space to move about. Carefully reaching out to the creature, he soon discovered two things. First, he was semi-positive this was indeed a starry wasp, thanks to the few foggy memories he managed to access. Though he'd have to properly bond to it before he could confirm it was an orange variant, and the specific one he'd meant to possess. Second, the dying insect was in a delirious state, making negotiations a little tricky. "Wake up, will you?" "I'm trying to help you," he said, leaving out the part that all of this was his fault in the first place. The good news was he was an expert at getting through to beasts by now. Most of his hosts fell in this category, so he'd had plenty of practice placating them. Simple-minded creatures as they were, it was all about honing into their instincts and desires, telling them what they wanted to hear. Usually, this meant promising them food or shelter. It took him a couple minutes, but eventually he succeeded. Well, it certainly helped he already knew what the bug wanted, to escape from his familiar's clutches. After establishing the preliminary connection to his host, he stretched his soul wisp, touching as many of the soul fragments as he could, before releasing all the stashed mana. Naturally, he didn't care about the expenditure this time. His main body was here to top him up if necessary, a luxury he wasn't used to. Once he finished patching everything up as best as he could, he finally managed to tap into his host's senses. The insect's vision wasn't that great, much too blurry for his liking. Still, he couldn't complain about what he saw. Standing in front of him was the most handsome man he'd ever laid eyes upon. "Hello, Percy,"